Well, everyone, here we are. It's been a while. We've been working on it for months now. I mean, it's been, in fact, quite a while that since I read the first chapter of The Anvil of Ice. Let's see how long ago that was. I uploaded it April 5th, 2024. It is now October 8th, 2024. So really, not that long. But at a Friday at a time, we have finally made our way through and we've reached the end of the trilogy. That's right, tonight brings us to the end of the Winter of the World, with the conclusion of the Hammer of the Sun. And I'm glad you guys have made the trip with me. We've seen as Alv started out as a foundling in the Anvil of the Ice, and his village was attacked by the Ekwesh, and he was adopted by the Master Smith, and he made three very, very nasty kind of, things. The bracelet, the helm, the sword. And through these three books has kind of destroyed the three of them, made bad choices, done wrong things, tried to set them right, chased after the love of his life in Kara, and has made dumb choices along the way. Has gone up against the powers, and now here at the end, he once again, basically, he was the one who stabbed Kara, destroying her, and took the full weight of the weapon that he had made of the sun onto him and used it to attack Lohi, and then flashed into the sky, and now we're coming down to find what the aftermath is. And so we start into chapter 12. And of course, as always, you can check out any of the previous chapters. They are all available on my YouTube. They're at youtube.com/@SirArminius. I am streaming there live as well right now. You are welcome to watch me on my Twitch channel if that's where you happen to be. You can also catch it on my YouTube channel. The Twitch channel, of course, will have ads that will pop up periodically. The ad revenue from that does help to support me and Project New Hope. YouTube, I am not, to the point where I am monetized on there, so I don't believe there are any ads that show up on there. So you can listen ad-free, but of course then it doesn't go to support me or Project New Hope. But hey, more viewers gets me to the point where eventually I might get to the point where I'm monetized with enough subscribers and things like that. So starting next week, my plan is to start into at least the first couple books of the Xanth series. They are not available from what I have been able to find on audiobook right now, so that is part of the reason why I am looking at those as a place to be able to read. For the most part, I'm trying to stay away from things that are out there already on audiobook, because those who are out there and have already put them on audiobook, you can get them through, um, Audible or any of those services, and generally um, the narrators do a pretty good job on them. I mean, there's some of them that are just horrible, and if that's the case, you could probably persuade me to get out there and do them. But if they're out there already, then you know what? Let's support the people who have taken the time to do it. But if not, I'm happy to put my stamp on some of it. But now, everybody, why don't you go ahead and sit back, relax, and prepare to enjoy as we reach the conclusion of The Hammer of the Sun and the trilogy of The Winter of the World by Michael Scott Rohan. Chapter 12. The Coming of the Spring. So much came to Elof in his vision, and many things else, both near and far. Perhaps among them he saw also what passed beneath him, as he drifted among the uppermost reaches of the airs. But for an account of that, whatever its origin, the chronicles must answer. Awesome as were the forces he had unleashed, the armies gathered among the hills had escaped them. The Charismen, almost a league away to the north and westward, were well sheltered by the intervening hills. But it seems that the light in the sky and the terrible blast that followed were too much for them. They were brave men, but they had fought too long and hard against forces they scarcely understood. Almost to a man they took to their heels, and those few captains who sought to restrain them were borne along in the rush. And in the end, that was as well, for they were not cut off from their homes and kin by the rising waters. The men of Morvenhall might have been less fortunate, had they not heeded Elof's warning and been crouched down behind the shield wall. Those among the Duergar wise in such arcane matters believed that the shields had mirrored more than light that day, for it was certain that such strange metals as were bound within that hammer could unleash 100 unseen deaths if ill handled. But none who were there, save perhaps Ilse and her folk, guessed anything of this. It is told in the chronicles that even as the roar and thunder of the riven land abated, and the earth grew still again, the first gusts blew of a mighty gale that scoured the smoke and dust from the air, and for a few minutes left the skies clear. Then the bravest among them ventured to peer shakily over their shield rims, marveling at the catastrophe that had occurred, and even more at their own preservation. And as they gathered courage and stood up upon shaky limbs, humbled and fragile in the face of so vast an event, they saw that outside the shelter of the shields, the snow and frost had been scorched from the hillside, and withered grasses were steaming in the sun. Their wonder grew when they perceived that all around them, upon every hill as far as the eye could reach, even beyond the possible reach of that blast, it was the same. The cloud that had maintained that wintry landscape was gone, blown apart and dispersed, and so no less was the will that had created it. Only then, with a shaky lift in their hearts, did they begin to understand. One of the first afoot was Kermorven, and though he was as awed as any by the spectacle of such utter devastation, he turned at once to see that his people were safe. He helped Ilse up, her wounded leg stiff beneath her, and kept her hand clasped tight in his own as he gazed around that shattered scene. And he it was who first voiced the hesitant hope that was slowly swelling to a certainty in all their minds. "A great change has come upon the world," he cried, his clear voice carried upon the wind. "The balance is turned back. The power of the ice is swept away. And down that wind, as though in answer, as if he had heard those words or perceived them in his vision, came Elof. Spiraling from the sky, he fell like a moth from a candle flame, whirling and tumbling like one of his own plumes upon ruined and smoldering wings. They saw him at once by the trail of smoke he left. Down over their heads he glided, black against the red of the sinking sun, and crashed onto the hillside above in a sprawl of limbs. Up the hill they streamed after him, his friends to the fore, though they dreaded what they were sure they would find. But some long strides away, Rock, who was first, stopped, hesitated, whispered, "Is that him?" For the man who lay upon the scorched grass, arms and legs outflung, had skin darkened to the hue of old bronze, and hair of purest white. "Ah," breathed Ills, her voice choked and hoarse. "He might almost be that Watcher. Fool! Of course it's him. But living?" As if hearing her somehow, the man stirred, moving his legs slowly, and Ills cried out. Beneath them, silver gleamed against the black ground, and a slow trickle of blood ran from the rags of his clothes. Forgetting her own pains, she hastened to tend him, and found, when she did so, that the anklets set in his legs had shattered, violently as it seemed, and the fragments were gradually working loose from his wounds. "He lives, then. But what more?" demanded Kermorven, returning with men bearing a shield lined with blankets, and bending over the anxious knot of figures. The gale was blowing ever more strongly from the south, a warm wind rich with the promise of rain, and heavy clouds were rising over the southward hills. "Will he awaken?" Ills looked up at him, her huge dark eyes troubled. "The wounds to his legs are healing already. His burns, not so. But we have salved them. As to wakening, well..." The first shadows of the night touched the hillside, and she sighed. Above the noise of the torrents, a distant rumble sounded in the sky. "His eyes are open, as they were from the first. I think he has heard all we said to him, but he does not seem to understand. It is as if he looks elsewhere, at things we cannot see, and we are not real to him." "He has flown too close to the sun," said a deep voice quietly from behind them. "That man may not do, and yet live." Kermorven jerked upright. An awful chill had lanced through him at the very sound of that voice, and he knew at once whose it was. The huge figure that stooped beside him had not been there only a moment since, and though from the huge, rough-shafted spear the man leaned upon he had the look of a warrior, no one in all the army wore such a long and dusty mantle of midnight blue, nor such a wide-brimmed hat. But even had Kermorven been a man of less swift thought, that chill would have warned him. "You!" he said, his words forming thick as blood upon his tongue with the wrath that welled up within him. "You, Raven! And well you are named, coming to settle upon a battlefield, and batten upon the fallen. May you fall in your turn, you callous crow of carrion, and drag down all your kind with you. Your kind that in their eternal squabbling trample unheeding upon the brief lives of men. He waved a furious hand at the devastation in the vale below. Why could you not have prevented that, friend of man that you claim to be? Why could you not save him, at least, rather than come prate above him? What better have you wrought with all your endless wars? Your kind, or the ice kind. One power is as bad for mankind as another. Why will you twist and turn the world this way and that between you? A lasting curse upon the whole pack of you. Why will you not leave men be to live their own lives? The figure turned its head, and he found himself staring into a single eye that gleamed bright as black waters beneath the shadows of the brim. The face in the shadows was lean, hook-nosed, seamed as an ancient oak, with lines that were a cryptic chart of long years of wisdom, and perhaps also of vast and joyous laughter. The rest was hidden beneath shaggy white hair and beard, but the eye was young and clear, that of a man in his vigorous prime, as he was himself. It surveyed him gravely, without anger, and with only the faintest tinge of mockery before it spoke. That will come, and this day has hastened it. That is worth a higher price than is paid. Be content. Kermorven glared at him. I may not be Elof to cross blades with the powers, but since he lies at death's door, I will at least have my say nonetheless. You despoiler of our... No! The commanding strength of the voice astonished him. But though it was deep and fair, it was not Raven's tone. Kermorven turned again, and though a man of courage, he found himself shaking uncontrollably. Elof stood before him, upright and straight upon his own strong legs, and though it obviously hurt his deep-burned face, he smiled. I heard you, but folks such as I don't die so easily, old friend. Kermorven, limp with astonishment, looked back at the Raven. You did come to help him. You saved him? The white beard tossed. I did nothing. All that was done, he did. But if it is help you wish, I may spare you some, my Lord Charon, under my ancient bond with your folk and line, and because I am indebted to you for your work today, I give you advice, and it is this. Begone from here at once, back to your ships with all your folk, and begone at once. But Karis, said Kermorven angrily, the unleashed waters threaten it, and all its folk. We must stay to succor them, at least, not only because they are our kindred, but all the more so. Raven growled impatiently. You cannot aid them, nor should you try. Do you not see why? But you knew that a great change was impending, that once again the world hung in the balance. Surely you realized that such things cannot be avoided, that the balance cannot be stayed, only tipped one way or another. This way or that? Very well. The balance has been tipped the better way, away from the changeless ice, towards the side of life. You have had a hand in that. Why rail against it now? Did you not know that life means change? Constant change? No, said Kermorven dully. I did not guess. But why not? The deep voice was rich, almost rejoicing. Nothing endures forever unchanging. Not the stone beneath your feet, nor the stars above your head. Not men, and not powers. Everything changes. Everything shifts. His eye gleamed brightly, as if at some secret only he knew. Overhead the stars were coming out, and the pale ribbon of the river stretched across the heavens. And why should it not? Would you have the river frozen and dead, as that one was below, or the river flowing? For if it did not, how would anything ever reach the sea? Silence lay across the shattered land. Even the thunder of the new forces below them seemed stilled for that time. The clouds were gathering fast, hiding the stars. The tall figure raised his spear. In the end, there are only two choices. Call them what you will. Growth or decay. Life or death. A clear river or a stagnant pond. The fate of Karis is hard. None know that better than I, who have watched over it since its birth, and joined my blood to its royal line. But it was old as the lands and races of men are reckoned, long overdue to alter, one way or another. Yet so entrenched was it in its ways, that only some such disaster might bring that about. Its folk must forget what was theirs, and struggle to find something new in a new land, as their ancestors did, and yours also. Harsh, yes, but consider how much harder the other way would have been. Kermorven lowered his eyes. You are right, and I should not have spoken as I did. The gray head nodded, and the voice became softer. All things go their way appointed, and in their own time. But I should not blame you for not grasping that truth. Even I did not wholly, till Ilmarinen taught it to me. Greatest of the elder powers. Most of his fellows never learned it, least of all Taun. And Taunatar after him. Well, she knows it now, and she has paid a grievous price for her knowledge. For like all her rebel kind, she has resisted change longest of all. Yet now it has been forced upon her, and her loss is all the more grievous. She was trapped in her body with no chance to leave it, and so she is severed from her power, reduced as Taun was to a shadow of her former self. It will fade now, that power, and with it, the ice. That will be a change for the better, will it not? But since all things are linked in the world, each acting upon another, you must accept one change as part of many others. You cannot pick and choose. Kermorven raised his head suddenly and stared in horror. He made as if to speak, reached out to seize the old man's mantle. Elof called out a warning, but faster even than his thought, the spear swung about in the gnarled hand, and the tip of the blade dug in beneath the point of Kermorvan's jaw. No more. Your duty is to your land. Linger here, and you will not live to fulfill it. The forces that were wielded today have flooded land and sky with poisons. My storm winds bear the worst of them northward to the ice, to speed the cleansing of what lurks there. But enough is left to put you all in peril. Kermorvan's mouth hardened with anger, and he pulled free of the insistent spear point. But without wasting time, he whirled about and shouted to the silent throng below the hill. Captains, to me! Herald, sound! Form up the march! We're going home! No other words could have aroused so thunderous a cheer from those weary throats, drowning even the thunderclap that burst overhead. But Kermorvan did not stay to acknowledge it. He turned back at once, with a question hovering on his lips, and then stood staring. The figure of the raven had vanished. Did you see him go? He demanded of Ilse and of Rock, but neither of them had. And you? Elof shrugged. That's a dark mantle he wears. He seemed simply to merge with the dark. Kermorvan looked at him strangely. You had nothing much to say to each other, he and you. Yet it was to you he always came. Elof returned the look. Everything he said was as true for me. Understanding widened Kermorvan's eyes. Of course. You have lost more to change. Far more. I grieved with you, my friend. I grieve now. Words will not serve me better. Rock grunted his agreement. He could not meet Elof's look as he took his hand, very gently, perhaps because of the burn. You deserved better, he said softly, after so long a struggle. From the shadows below the horns were sounding, summoning the army to the march. Do you feel able to walk now? To ride? Elof nodded. I do. In body, at least. I am healing. For the rest? His eyes seemed to lose their focus once more, to gaze into distances undreamt of. That is harder to tell. But I will come with you. For now. A slow rain began to fall about them as they set off down the hill. The march to the sea was a silent one at first, but by the second day it became more triumphal in mood, as the true measure of their victory at last began to dawn upon the weary soldiers, and the promise of going home. Even the prospect of short commons and a long voyage could not dampen their joy, but they kept it muted out of respect for their king, and for the master smith who had wielded such awesome power at such cost to himself. But for the most part, both men rode in silence, and Kermorvan most of all, to Ilse's deep concern. Something troubles him. Something more than I can understand, she told Elof as they rode. Do you know what it might be? Elof looked at her and took her hand in his. I cannot help, Ilse, was all he said. With the column marched the ravens and their many captives, whom Kermorven pardoned and proclaimed free. When they came to the coast and their landing, he offered them all their freedom and their ships to seek out their homeland. But to a man they declined. They were his followers and his people, and preferred to follow his fortunes if he would permit it. To this he agreed, since there was land enough and to spare in his eastern realm. And through them I may one day come to some peace with the Eqwesh settlers in the west, he added to his friends. With the grip of the ice loosening upon them, they may become more reasonable. In time, he added, looking hard at Elof. A wise hope, I think, was all Elof replied. It did not seem to satisfy the king. It was an exchange neither Ills nor Rock understood, and it grieved them that there seemed to be some cause of tension between two such fast friends. But neither would give any clue as to what it might be, until the dawn when the fleet at last set sail. Last of all to weigh anchor was the Prince Corentin, and at its stern stood the king and his friends, looking back. As the great ship turned its head out into the bay, catching the freshening wind, Elof leaned back intently, as if listening to some remote sound. I don't hear, began Rock, but Kermorven held up his hand, and together they listened. A moment later, Ills looked around sharply. It sounds like bells, she said, and bit her full lip. I, said Rock uneasily, couldn't make it out, but bells, it must be. From Karis. Kermorven nodded. So it is, but they are swinging with the waves now. Soon the waters will ring the bells even in that great city, in those high towers I have never seen, save in my dreams. And where else, Master Smith? Where else? Such was the anger in his voice that Ills caught him by the arm. He knows, said Kermorven softly, what I was about to ask the Raven. He knows the question. He may even know the answer, but he will not tell me. He controlled himself with difficulty and stood up, very straight. As your friend, I might have claim on your truthful answer, Master Smith, but as a king, you owe it to me. Elof ran his fingers through his whitened mane. He had never felt older or wearier than now. You shall have it, he said, but not now. When, then? Demanded Kermorven tautly. When I choose. But it will not be long delayed. That I promise you. The voyage back was by all accounts swift and sure, but to Kermorven it must not have seemed so. Nevertheless, it was clear to Elof that he was doing his best to be content with that promise, and be the friend he had always been, and that was what Elof most desired. He surrounded himself with his friends as much as he could, and this did not go unnoticed. Almost as if you're savoring us, said Rock bluntly. Storing us up so you won't forget. Not thinking of setting out on one more lunatic search, are you? Because lunatic it will be, I promise you. At your age, in your condition. Ills put an arm around his shoulder. If she remembers you still, she will do the searching. There is nobody now who can hold her back. Louhi will have problems of her own. Elof smiled, but it became a grimace of pain. What I did to her? That may hold her back. Even at the last, I betrayed her, Ills. No, said Kermorven, pouring him a stoup of wine, made doubly precious by their short supplies. Drink this, man, and take heart. I was there, I saw, and I will judge you, as is my right, as once before I declined to. You did what was inevitable, with no time for thought, and you were shielding me. If the old Kara is there, she will not forget that. Maybe, said Elof quietly. What you say may be true. But meanwhile, I am waiting for a sign. And though I am happy among you all, I grow weary. At long last there came a sunset when the mastheads hailed land on the horizon. That brought Kermorven and the others on deck, but to their surprise, they found Elof already there. He was huddled up by the steersman's bench against the cold night wind, and coughing. He looked up as the king approached. I said I would answer your question one day, Kermorven, and this is the day. Kermorven's face went gray, and he sat down heavily on the bench. I feared it might be. Visibly he gathered his strength. Tell me, then, and have done with it, what Lohi threatened me with, and I laughed away for the army's sake. It has haunted me all these days and nights since. I see it in my dreams even. Was it true? Yes, said Elof quietly. It was. It is. Ills and Rock stared down at him aghast, but he shook his head sadly. Think of it. Where did the waters come from that make up the great glaciers of the ice? From the seas, in the end, and their levels fell. New coastlines were laid bare. New land emerged, as other land was covered. And men took that land, because it was farthest from the ice, and because no other power held it in their dominion, as Tapaiau does the forests. The old kingdoms of men were crushed, and it was in coastal lands that their new realms sprang up, even those of the Ekwesh. Why was the Vale of Karis so deep, think you? Because once before, it was a sea, and waves broke over that smooth ridge where the gate was built. The Yscienus was all that remained of that sea. It only reclaims what was taken from it. He laughed till it turned to a coughing fit. Ironic, isn't it? Karis, Morvanik, Morven, Kerbrahane. Men settled those great realms to escape the ice. Men held them against it. Yet all the time they were the ice's own creation, as unnatural in the world as it was. And now Taunatar is weakened. The others of her kind will not be able to sustain it. It has ceased its advance. Slowly it will melt and withdraw, and the oceans will reclaim their own. How soon? Demanded Rock in horror. How soon? Are you telling us we've no home left awaiting us over the horizon there? Was that why you waited? Elof smiled and lifted a hand. From overhead came a joyous cry. Morvenhall in sight! Morvenhall to starboard! Palace and tower! Home! We're home! That, at least I can spare you, he said. It comforts me somewhat. And you did not notice the glaciers shrinking before we sailed, did you? They almost made themselves the ruling forces in the climes of the world. And such a presence will be slow to disperse. It will take time. Many lifetimes of men, I think. But not so many. 3, 4, 5 perhaps, before the waters begin to swallow the coasts. But after that, it will become swift. New lands will be laid bare when the glaciers melt, said Ilse encouragingly, as they were before. That's something, isn't it? Kermorven did not lift his head when he spoke. As I feared. That cannot be enough time to find and clear enough new land, even if the powers that linger will let us. And the lands that were under the ice will take longer still to recover. Oh, we will manage something, somehow, with your folk to help us. Men will endure, but not their realms. We will dwindle, as did your folk, or revert to simple, rustic folk, even savages and barbarians. It happens even now to Karis, but soon we also shall be devoured. He stood suddenly, and his face was bitter and bleak, his fists clenched white at his breast. So ends my fool's dream. My dream of founding a realm and a dynasty, a land of prosperity and wisdom, of strength and justice. Not one that would last forever. I needed no raven to tell me that. But that would last as long as Karis, and leave as great a name? Or, at the least, some tangible mark and memory in the hearts of men. But whatever I achieve still, it will melt and vanish, and be dissolved in the eternal changes of the sea. I should have known better, this world being what it is. It was all in vain. Elof also rose, though with difficulty. No, he said quietly, and put a hard hand on Kermorven's shoulder. It was not, and it will not be. The tall man turned, his bronze hair streaming in the breeze with the look in his face of one who hears a distant horn call. It will not be, repeated Elof. I did you an injustice, my old friend. You spoke still of the future, of what you might still achieve, hopeless or not. Had I been sure you would, I would have answered you sooner, and not delayed till I had to. Hear then and hope on. Without your kingship, without you, there would have been no victory, no chance of any men at all surviving, civilized or not. But they will, now. Civilization will come again, where without you, without all of you, it could not have. It will come again, because from the fires you light in the years to come, small sparks will be kept alight, little enclaves of wisdom in a world newborn, and ignorant of all things newborn are. Some of their knowledge, some of their wisdom, that will survive to pass down the years, even if men forget whence it came, and keep only a dim memory of legend, of an age of vanished glory. All save that memory may be lost, yet still it will inspire them to glories of their own. Your name All our names they may forget, but the image of your kingdom, your line, shall burn bright in their hearts. They will cross seas in quest of it once more, and perhaps the name of Caris, of the glorious city of Wise, will not be wholly forgotten. Men may hear its bells ringing still, there beneath the waves. You shall have your dynasty, Cairn Carmorvan, and no king ever founded one greater. It shall be all mankind. When Carmorvan spoke at last, it was with difficulty. It is greater than I deserve, then. I am comforted, and I am humbled. I can hope still. May our children and theirs be worthier. Eh, my Lady Ills? She smiled then, but she also could not speak. It was Rock who spoke first. That goes for me also. But Elof, I don't know if I should ask, but how can you be so bloody sure? And you said you had to tell now, whispered Ills. Why, Elof? Why? Carmorvan nodded. I wonder also. Yet I do not doubt you. What sight is given you, Elof Valentor? Elof smiled again, though a cough racked him painfully. The sight of the bird that breaks its shell. As a bird indeed I saw it first, blown this way and that on the heights. A light shone all about me, it seemed, and only my own poor self was in the way of it. As Louhi said, we do not die so easily, our kind. But Kara was right to sense a change coming. It was for us both. Who are you? Carmorvan whispered. I have asked you that before, but who are you? A man, like yourself, answered Elof, with only a tinge of amusement. Exceptional in some ways, perhaps. But then, all men are, if only they can discover how. I live by eating and drinking. I grow ill. I feel pain. I bleed. Age comes upon me. What more would you have? I have smithcraft in me, but then so do all men in whom the blood of the powers is still mingled richly enough. Yourself included, Carmorvan. But he hesitated. Once I was something more. No, more than once. What in Hella's curlies are you talking about? Demanded Rock. Elof grinned. In no place so arcane. Bear with me. It is hard to explain. There is still so much that I can't remember, or only have a brief glimpse of. More than my mind will hold. Say, if you like, that I have lived many lives. Stay! So commanding was the word, so absolute the gesture, that instead of springing up in astonishment or fear, they swayed towards him and were silent. Or that someone has. Each one different. None of them resulting in the man who speaks to you now. How could they, when so many different memories must make up a man? Yet each one began from a common core. Each was a different path to an end, and that core endured. Most were failures, but I am not. He grimaced. Not entirely. Not at the last. For if I learned one thing in all those lifetimes, learned it with pain and suffering and damnable follies, it was this. He coughed so that his whole body shook. That only a man free of the powers could free men from them. He smiled again. As free they must become in the end, Kermorven, however great the cost. So I forswore all that was mine, knowledge and power beyond your comprehension, and now beyond mine. Forswore it wholly, as I had never before dared do so. On that path, there was no going back. I forgot entirely who I had been. When I became the infant foundling they named Alv, I set myself forever within the limits of men. And you chose Assenby, murmured Kermorven, as if in a dream, where a scepter was being used as a cattle goad. A scepter that would draw me through my great smithcraft to its rightful lord, in the end, said Elof, and became aware of a vast laughter bubbling up within him, and where an agent of Lohi would come, drawn in his turn, though neither of us ever guessed it. Only I had reckoned without the raven. He knew of me, none better. No other did. Not Tapaiao, not even Lohi, though she saw something in me she did not understand. Raven chose to shorten my ways somewhat, in his own twisted fashion, but never freely. I had always to earn his help, however paltry. Of my own, I had nothing, save one legacy left myself against great need, and that was the sword Talanthar, which I renamed Gorthar, and the knowledge that lay bound up in it. And both of those I had to find anew for myself. Vade's sword, said Rock quietly, as they knew in Karis. And you were drawn to Vade's forge. So it was Vade you were, right enough. Vade was himself, and for what he was when he perished in the great marshes, though nobly enough at the last. Poor creature. He knew too much of what he was, and not enough of men, and both were torment to him. He failed, though not completely. Him you might have feared, for he was more than a man, but I, he laid his hands in his lap, I am a man. All my life, that is what I have thought myself. And now that I know my history, I feel only the more sure of it. I'm afraid that you might think otherwise, that you, my oldest friends, might not accept me as you always have. He smiled wryly. Whatever my human failings. No one answered at first, and the sound of the waves grew very loud in their ears. But then, impulsively, Ills caught his hand and held it tight. Ass! Of course you're a man! Does it take a Duergar girl to tell you that? Well, said Rock thoughtfully, you look like the same lad I've chased around, and about half this world with. And I reckon nobody but a man could get in some of the scrapes I've hauled you out of. He chuckled. Or haul me out of mine. So we'll give you the benefit of the doubt, Kermorven? I think that might be arranged, said Kermorven dryly, though a great wonder was still in his eyes. Indeed, I have known you too well, too long to think otherwise, and I have always thought it an honor, even then. Yet, but there he caught himself and said no more. There Ill snorted. There he goes again. Too damned courteous. Elaf, you are who you are, and you're a fool to think we'd have you otherwise. After the first surprise, that is. But once you were someone else, you've told us. Someone apart from those other lives. Have you remembered who? Elaf laughed suddenly, and fell to coughing so hard, his hand clenched tight upon hers. I'm sorry. My chest seems afire. I was only remembering you and I, Kermorven, in the earliest days arguing about what your Kerbrahane philosophers thought, about whether the powers could take human shape, and why, whether it was to understand men better. I wish they could have met Lohi. It is not the shape that gives understanding, but the life. As I was, I never understood the hearts of men. I longed to. So at last I plucked up the courage and made what I thought a great sacrifice. Frighteningly great. Freely, I forgot all of myself, leaving only the essence, the inner fire. And fire it was indeed. For the light and fire that gave life to the world, they were my element once, as the waters were Nairads and Saethanas, and the forests Tapaiaus, as the airs were Tionatars and Tiouns once, till they armored themselves in the dead ice. We were the minds that roved in the forces, set within them to the long labors of shaping a world, destined in the end to change and become a part of it, to join with men. We take human shape more easily than any other, because that is the shape we must all take in the end, and the destiny we must share. Lohi may, soon, and I wish her joy of it, ill-prepared as she is, though she will still have something of her beauty to help her. I embraced that change, because I knew it must come, and oddly enough, I feel more myself than ever before, for I was Ilmarinen, forger of mountains, smith of the powers, and I am all of him that remains. Ilmarinen, gasped Ills, and would have sunk down at his feet, had he not caught her and raised her, though she shivered at his touch. Small wonder that I, Elaf smiled, saw something in me? It is so, and it is not out of place. For in his way, Ilmarinen always loved your race as much as they him. But I would rather be your friend still than what he has been to you, for I share your world, not his, save only in this. We who have dwelt upon the heights, we cannot enjoy the surcease of a single life, a single death. It may be that men cannot either. Of the knowledge only a glimmering remains. But this I know, we at least may rest between our human lives, may find long surcease from our labors. I have earned it, and perhaps more. For when I took courage at last, and embraced that change, I found something new rewarded me, something I had never managed to find before. And if it is lost to me as a man, then by pursuing that change, I may find it yet. You asked me, Ills, why I had to tell you now. It is this. I was waiting for a sign, and that sign has come. He stood, and they stood with him. It is time to say farewell, my friends, but not forever. I will never be far from you, in this life or any other. For harsh as the world may seem, yet against all hope, we may make things of worth endure. Even that most fragile thing of all, that we call love. For see there. The voice was a man's, but such a weight even of remembered power resounded within it that, as the tale is told, no man on board could look anywhere but where his lifted arm pointed. High above the coasts of Morvenhall, where red stone and white tower gleamed in distant harmony, a dark speck appeared, flying swift against the wind that bore them home. And it seemed to those who had been the friends of Elof Valantor, greatest of all master smiths among men, that for a moment that wind blew strong and fierce and warm all about them, as if great wings beat within. And when they turned to Elof, the deck was empty where he had stood. Only a few fragments of silver lay there, and an arm ring of pale gold, abandoned as things childish are when their need and use is past. No man heeded them, for their eyes were held skyward, higher and ever higher, to where two great swans flew up, circling ever closer in a graceful spiral until they seemed to vanish among the clouds into the last rich light of the sun. And though to them it set, the watchers knew in their hearts that elsewhere it arose again in spreading, undying fire. Well, did you guys expect that Elof was one of the powers all along, but that he was Ilmarinen? Yes? No? Maybe? And hey, Emma, if you happen to still be here, hello. Sorry, I don't interact with chat, too much during the chapters. But we'll move on into the coda. So here we go. Coda. It came to pass even as Elof had foretold. Under the wise rule of Cairn Carmorven and his queen, the last kingdom of men flourished and spread far along the eastern shore, ever joining and mingling more with the Duergar as the years passed. King Cairn lived to an astonishing age, far beyond the span of his eldest subjects, save only his great chancellor, the Lord Rock. Until their end they both kept strength and vigor. And in that, perhaps the Lady Ills had a hand, and the healing arts of the Duergar, but it may have been another's gift. After the king's death, Ills returned to her folk, and with her aged father long ruled that remnant who would not mingle with men, but chose to live out their lives under stone. And though they stayed long in friendship with the kingdom of her children, she herself never came there again. But it is said that on the morning King Cairn died, two black swans came to perch a brief while upon the heights of the palace, and then flew off to the southwest, filling the dawn air with cries that seemed not of sorrow, but of gladness. And the chronicles affirm that two like them returned ever and again in later years, at the death of Rock, and of all they had known, and of all the kings of Carmorven's line, till at last the city was abandoned to the rising waters, and a lasting end was come of the days both dark and heroic of the long winter of the world. Where now are the bones of Wayland the Wise, Boethius, consolation of philosophy, in the rendering of Alfred the Great. And now we'll move into our appendix. Appendix. Of the land of Caris, its form, nature, and climate, and of its peoples and their several histories, such as are set forth in that volume of the Winter Chronicles called the Book of the Armring. In reducing to a single tale the long span of years covered in the Book of the Armring, the many strands of lives and events that weave and intertwine throughout, the many details of people and places, much has had to be omitted, or told only from afar. For it was the mastersmith Elof Valantor who proved, unknown even to himself, to be the prime mover in that troubled time, and his tale is the one that matters most. Also, as before, the authors of the Chronicles could scarcely help writing for their own times and their own folk, so inevitably they leave much unexplained that we no longer know, or explain at length matters we would today take for granted. This account cannot replace all that is missing, or has had to be curtailed, but it may at least paint in more detail the backdrop, like a remote and misty landscape against which these events took place. The land. The land of Caris, with which the Book of the Armring is principally concerned, was like no other in the world at that time, uniquely suited to provide a refuge for men against the ravages of the long winter, and a fit cradle for the birth of a great civilization. In form, it was as Elof and Rock saw it, a river valley of immense size. In extent, it must have been greater even than they realized, stretching at its widest some 600 or 700 leagues from the western oceans to its eastern margins, and from north to south over 200 leagues at its widest. In former days, when it also included great regions of the hinterlands above its northern and southern walls, its area can only be guessed at, but these were gradually lost to the ice and to the desert that crept relentlessly northward, like its malign shadow. By the time of Elof's arrival, the last of them had become the wild lands, home to none save the scattered remnants of the Duergar. The account given by Elof of the origin of Caris is substantially correct. However, it had gone through many such changes before. Originally, it appears to have been a low-lying, landlocked basin, probably a barren desert, founded upon rock chiefly of granite and limestone types. It was held back from the oceans by a land barrier at its eastern end. Gradually, this was eroded away, until at last the seas came flooding in and over in a waterfall of astonishing size and height. This probably created the ridge upon which the gate was built. The shape depicted on surviving marginal sketches, though obviously much narrowed and steepened on its seaward side by men to make a defense, still suggests a shallow crescent typical of wide falls such as Niagara, or the awesome rock face long dry at Malham Cove in Yorkshire, England. The waters that poured over that fall turned the basin into an inland sea, but in this succession of long winters launched against the living world, enchaining more and more of the world's waters, its level sank and it became land once more, only to rise again as each winter came to its end. This the Duergar seemed to have known, but among men, more recent arrivals, it was either never realized or wholly forgotten. These successive floodings were not without their effect on the once infertile land. The waters had eroded much hard rock to sand, and into this inflowing rivers, as well as diluting the salt content, poured rich loads of upland silt, fertile volcanic debris distributed by the waters into which it fell, may also have played a part. As the level of the seas outside gradually declined, the waters drew back and left these deposits open to the air. Land plants came to grow on this new soil, found it, and enriched it with their remains, and after them trees and animals, establishing a whole fertile cycle. Certainly the results, by the time men first came there, was a black alluvial soil of remarkable richness, and on the higher ground, brown earths of the podzol type. Developed under the vast tracts of deciduous forest which then covered the land. In the more southerly areas, the less fertile terra rosa soils formed on limestone. By later days, however, the richest soils had been exhausted by over-farming, and the forests cleared altogether from much of the land. The unity of the soil was destroyed, and much of it was simply blown or washed away. Even before its drowning, Caris, rich as it seemed, was a dying land. The Great River. So it was that Caris was, in a very real sense, created by the river, and the river continued to dominate it, as the name the Penruthia, or southern people, gave it, Yeskienus, acknowledged. Kien was a rather poetic name for a vein, and so this meant vein of the heartland, or as it was understood, river at the heart of the world. The Svarhoth, inhabiting the north of the land, took a less central view and called it simply Myklastavathian, the Great River. As sea levels had declined, so the falls over the ancient barrier had ceased to flow, save for a small central cranny or channel that the river cut itself, probably by following some crack or flaw in the eroded rock, or some softer intrusion. This admitted a relatively restricted flow of seawater, but it was soon swelled and its salt diluted by inflows from various tributaries to north and south. Some of these were created or swelled by meltwater directly from the ice, and this brought with it the same terrors as did the upper reaches of the Gorlafrost to the marshlands in Norderney. But the great river dispersed these in its vastness as it rode peaceably through the center of the land, and in some trace of darker influence remained, a slow poison for the mind and spirits of the people, it cannot now be said. Past the warm lands where men founded Caris the river flowed, until at last it broadened to become a great lake, more properly, an inland sea. Those waters were little navigated or frequented. The lands around their shores were hot and unwelcoming when men first arrived there, with many regions of marsh along the coasts, and tempted nobody to settle save the most desperate of outlaws. By Nethaid's time, thousands of years later, the marshes had spread, and the rest degenerated into barrens in the north and near desert in the south. Through those marshes, along many small streams and channels, the waters of the Yeskienus drained southward, and though much was lost by sheer evaporation, at least one river was thought to reach the mysterious oceans to the south. But it was not navigable, and its course, if it ever was known, had long been lost. Adventurers in those lands had brought back little of worth, but many plagues and spreading maladies, until the reputation of the area for disease was such that landing there was forbidden on pain of death. If any ventured it, therefore, they left no records, and no certain maps have survived. The High Gate. Such was the course of the great river, and a vein it was indeed to the land, and the ships that carried their produce to feed the great city at its heart, and at need their soldiers to enforce its defense and royal authority. that so many of their towns were built along its shores and at its confluences is ample witness of this. Its importance was obvious to the people of the land even from the earliest years. Very soon they began building over that narrow crevices in the ancient barrier and the falls that came through it, the first stages of what was to become the High Gate. They had many reasons for sitting such a fortress there, but high among them was the desire to protect the source of the river that was their land's life. At that time, they had not yet grown complacent and lost their awareness of what the ice or some other enemy might do. Generation after generation built the gate higher and grander, and as the sea level fell outside, they cut down and narrowed the ancient barrier into a well too steep for any enemy to scale. In the end, the gate towered high over the ancient ridge, an imposing palace atop walls smooth and utterly unscalable, guarding the river that thundered through its depths, and it became a sign in the minds of men, a symbol of the fountainhead of the land they loved. A fire was set on its roof, guiding mariners by day with its smoke, and by night with its flame, and to them, in particular, it became an almost sacred sight, their last upon setting sail, and their first upon their return. Since it was the greatest and most adventurous mariners who discovered the new lands across the ocean, it became especially important to them, and for those who fled into exile to found a new realm there, it was a poignant memory, the last they were ever to see of Caris. So it was that even when, with the decline of Caris, the gate had ceased to mean so much to its people, their kin beyond the seas were still invoking its name. Climes. The compression of climes that the long winter created throughout the world was particularly acute in Caris at the time of Elof's coming. This was because the ice had been able to distribute itself very differently than in Bracehall. To onlookers such as Elof and Rock, the great ice sheets appeared at first to have extended far further south, but in fact the borders of the main sheets followed much the same parallel as across the oceans. What they had been able to do, however, was create an advance guard of secondary ice sheets by the means Ansgar described in the Book of the Swords, colonizing the heights of more southerly mountain ranges by extending glaciations from mountain snowcaps. The land immediately beyond the main ice sheets had no such peaks, but was hilly and uneven enough to impede their advance. It became the tundra landscape of Taunla, snowy, bleak, and haunted, an evil place in whose northern reaches nothing save the hardiest lichens could survive. Over this, however, cold airs and subtler influences spread to the mountain peaks beyond. Gradually their ice caps swelled and gathered strength and gave birth to glaciers that flowed down below the snow lines, joined and became vast enveloping ice sheets that no longer changed with the seasons, but were as permanent as the main body of the ice. In fact, it was the ice glow from these, and not from the main body, that Elof and Rock saw from Elon Gorhainian. There were now two of them, each the size of a substantial country, and steadily growing by the same process. Each winter, the cold fingers of the glaciers would spread further along the more southerly peaks, and leave them that fraction colder. And though with the thaw they would retreat again, it would not be all the way. Each year they had gained a little more ground, until now in winter they thrust deep into what had been the north of Caris, and spun their webs of frost and snow over valleys that had once been high green pastures, home to hardy farmers of the Svarthoth folk. Now they were miserable barrens, and even when the snow had drawn back, many evils stalked them under the shadow of those peaks. South of these troubled lands, the land was still fertile and rich, though it suffered from severe winters that killed off a great part of its game. Once it had been the main home of the Svarhoth, who were for the most part free landholders and cultivators, save when they lived by the sea. Then it had held their pastures and grain fields, for they raised both, and many other crops besides. There had even been orchards for the more robust fruits, and a few vineyards on the most southerly slopes. But most of that people had fled the advance of the ice thousands of years since. And now these were the wild lands, overgrown and tangled, home only to the Duergar and human outlaws, and much feared on that account. From time to time, under some more vigorous king, attempts had been made to clear and resettle parts of them. But in winter, these little colonies were isolated for long periods, and sooner or later they came to a bad and mysterious end. Many blamed the Duergar rather than the ice, and it is not impossible that they were right. But to the people of the Vale, its steep sides, in many places impassable cliffs, remained an effective barrier against the worsening conditions above, and for centuries this seemed to be so. In their shelter, the land north of the great river enjoyed a warm, temperate climate, growing gradually warmer as the river angled away to the southeast. The lands of the southern shore were much the same in the regions about the gate, but as they sloped away sharply southward, they grew increasingly warm and humid, basking in a warmth semi-tropical and even fully tropical with high humidity. A great belt of dense rainforest covered the southernmost slopes of the vale and extended out to envelop the southern mountains. Beyond these, however, the land grew equally swiftly hot and dry, and the forest gave way to parched scrubland, sun-baked barrens, and at last sheer desert. And though it was hardly noticeable at first, this too was advancing, as the ice drained more and more of the free water from the cycle of life, and bound it in chill and sterile chains. Thus the extremes of clime that had first brought Karis into being were all the millennia of its existence closing upon it like the jaws of a nutcracker, and all the while the shell was growing rotten from within. The last winter. This was the closing of the jaws, the disordering of climes in whose fell grip the fleets of Morvanik found Karis. It began soon after Nethade's death and Elof's flight, as if either or both of them had been holding it somehow at bay. And this may be the case. It started as an early, fierce autumn, with stormy rains that ruined the harvest, and frosty nights that froze the sodden ground hard. Bitter blasts whipped the southern forests, blowing ever more of their tenuous topsoil from the great areas that man had cleared for his own husbandry, or simply laid waste. The first snows for thousands of years fell there, and the plants shriveled. In the north, the snows fell heavier, and the river began to slow and freeze. Then at last men saw their folly in neglecting the gate, and cursed the Launuan line that had let it slip from their grasp. Somehow men managed to survive the winter, though food was scarce, and many dark perils stalked the land, eagerly awaiting the spring, and some kind of thaw. But the time came, and there was no thaw. The snows did not slacken, nor did the glaciers relinquish their hold upon the mountains high above the walls. Ice stopped the inflow of the great river at last, and its level began to fall. What was happening to the northward can only be guessed at, But it is likely that the main body of the ice was beginning its long delayed advance at last, and setting in motion the final stages of Louhi's plan. Certainly, the hilly tundra was more densely covered in snow than ever before. With the weather so propitious, in a very short time, weeks or days even, it might be about to form a solid sheet and allow the main body to reach and merge with its two offshoots, and they in turn to stretch forward and join up with the enclave of ice around the gate, where Louhi was exerting her own power. From there, the path of the ice would have been easy and obvious, down the great river and into the heart of Karis. Formerly, its sheer size must have made it almost impossible to freeze, keeping a constant temperature in its depths, and also its salinity. Ever since its flow had been reduced at the gate falls, however, only its tributaries were feeding it, and it had been growing fresher. This may explain the dearth of fish Elof found around the island. Now, with many of the northern tributaries themselves frozen, it was also dwindling in size. Already half frozen, with the ice itself behind her, she could undoubtedly transform it almost at a stroke from river to glacier, from a bearer of life to a harbinger of death, overwhelming a vast area of land. Whether this in itself would have been enough to overturn the climatic balance of the world and make the ice permanent, we cannot now tell. But from the urgency all the powers seemed to have sensed, it almost certainly was the crucial point. As to what brought this about, the chronicles offer no better explanations than Elof's, and they seem to be right. Recent research suggests that the forces he saw at work would indeed have produced the results he feared, and ironically, it is from the ice sheets that the evidence comes. The Antarctic ice cap preserves a remarkable record of many atmospheric events and changes, and among these are any particularly great volcanic eruptions. These hurl vast amounts of dust and gases, in particular sulfur dioxide, high into the atmosphere. And it is this gas, converted to fine droplets of sulfuric acid, that the ice preserves. Comparing concentrations of this in ice of known age with records of climatic changes over the same period have produced remarkable correlations between, for example, the enormous eruption of Tambora in Indonesia and the extraordinarily severe weather in the northern hemisphere in the first years of the 19th century, known significantly as the Little Ice Age. Studies of later eruptions when more accurate records exist, such as Krakatoa in 1883, or more recently Mount St. Helens, establish that the temperature not only of the particular region, but of the Earth as a whole, falls by several tenths of a degree in the years following a major eruption, chiefly because of the filtration effect of the dust in the upper atmosphere upon received solar radiation. Most of that dust falls to the Earth in only a few days, but enough remains to make a significant difference. The effect of a number of such active volcanoes over a period of many years, capped at the climax by a period of extra violent eruptions, and in a restricted area where the ice could at least strongly influence wind patterns to gather and sustain more dust than usual, is difficult wholly to imagine. It would certainly be savage, turning the sky to a permanent louring gray, chilling the air and stifling photosynthesis in plants. The sudden glaciation of the river might well increase the volcanism still further, but even without that, it would have been quite conclusive enough for Louhi's needs. The peoples. The people of Karis. It is accurate to say people, for the division between Svarhoth and Penruthia, northerner and southern, that so bedeviled the Westlands, had always mattered less in Caris, and by the time of Elof's coming was almost extinct. Nevertheless, it had its roots there, and they helped to understand its history. Originally, it may have reflected the merging of two distinct peoples, relics perhaps of the forgotten racial strands in the little kingdoms of the north before the ice came, and that now were less than legendary. Kingdom, indeed, may have been too grand a word. More probably, most were mere tribal leagues as loose as the Eqwesh, and at best small and fluid monarchies of various kinds like Northumberland or Mercia in Dark Age England, or the Burgundian and Frankish realms that grew up around the Roman Empire. Almost certainly the dominant kingdom among the Penruthia was a city-state, because it was a central mold they never escaped, but simply expanded to fit the land. Even in so vast a realm as Caris, which had perforce to have several great cities, one immense community dominated all the rest. The Svarhoth never showed quite the same tendency. Their preference was always for towns of moderate size among a loose federation of villages. Probably it was the threat of the ice that first drove these related but disparate peoples to unite, but nothing certain is known of that. It is well established, however, that in even the earliest records of Caris, they thought of themselves as one nation, owing allegiance to one lord, intermarrying freely, and speaking one another's tongues. It was chiefly a preference for different climes and manners of life that kept them separate at all, and perhaps also kept them friendly, for they seldom, if ever, competed for the same land. The character of both peoples was much the same as in the realms of Bracehall. The Penruthia of Caris were always the more numerous race, probably because their way of life allowed it. They were a lowland folk, fond of warm climes and the vast, rich farmland of riverine plains. They grew much grain and many orchards and vineyards, but raised little meat or dairy produce, and almost no fish. Their lands tended to be divided into large estates, whose farms were held in tenancy from the great lords. But this tenancy was not a burdensome thing, and until the last years the land was worked at all levels by free men. Some of the estates on the southern shore, settled later, were of astonishing size. Their laborers numbered by the thousand, and their lords men of great consequence. Their cities showed the same tendency towards size, but in a well-ordered form. They were masters of buildings, as of all the other arts, and had a surprising command of the basic requirements in water supply and sanitation that alone made such communities practicable. Their laws regarding public health were strict and carried severe penalties, and they were supported by all levels of the community, even the lowest. Almost certainly this was a result of the state's provision of basic instruction for all its citizens. What was provided varied wildly, but in Caris the city, at its height, there was almost no citizen of sound mind who could not read and write, and recite the basic table of laws. The Penruthia had a strong tradition of hierarchy and the rule of law from above, but set against this an equally strong tradition of freedom, if not of equality, for all men. This often took the form of opposition to their kings, commonly by powerful lords in pursuit of their own independence. The Svarhoth, on the other hand, had no particular tradition of order, and few, if any, great lords. They reserved their respect of wise elders and rich men, and regarded the king much as a clan might its chieftain, their ruler, but by right of kinship more than law. They chose to dwell chiefly among the cooler uplands above the northern walls of Caris Vale, a land that seemed far too coarse and wild to the Penruthia, but could in fact yield a rich living to men who knew how to cultivate it. They grew some grain, wine grapes, and other fruit in the sheltered valleys, but meat and dairying were their main products. Upon hill and mountain pastures they raised their huge cattle, and upon higher slopes of coarser vegetation sheep or goats. Wise in all matters relating to ships and seafaring, they fished not only the rivers, but also the rich seas around the coast. They also thrived upon forestry and hunting, for they took better care of their woodland lands than did the Southrons. Landholdings were mostly no larger than an individual could manage. Even the richest men might own no more than a single manorial farm, albeit a very large one, and some woods and hunting preserves. Tenancy was almost unknown and treated with deep suspicion. Some villages, however, owned and worked large holdings in common, and so also some families, for a particular reason. Land was inherited not by the eldest male heir, as with the Penruthia, but by all the sons jointly. Only if it could not support them all would some have to seek their support elsewhere. Since large families were rare among the Svarhoth, this usually worked well enough. There were plenty of opportunities for such sons. Shipping and the crafts were honorable and prosperous occupations that supported many, and also matters financially and scholarly. The Penruthia appeared to dominate trade, but never to the exclusion of an energetic northerner. Indeed, since it was Svarhoth-owned ships that handled the cream of the swift river traffic, they had considerable influence in it, and many a southern lord owed his fortune to the acumen and industry of his Svarhoth stewards. And in scholarship and statecraft, which they tended to associate, both strains mingled readily, the Penruthia excelling only by their numbers. In general, this union of peoples was a strong one, each fulfilling somewhat different roles, each benefiting from what the other lacked and respecting the other for it. It was a strong foundation upon which to build such a realm. Such friction as there was appeared to have been mild, easily contained by the Ysmerian kings who mingled the blood of both races. And it is noticeable that when serious factional problems did break out in Caris, the division was more social than racial. The plebeian and patrician factions that appeared among the Penruthia were reflected among the northerners, though less aggressively. But then the distinctions between lord and commoner were never so important there. The factions plagued the land, but never seriously divided it. The real difficulties began when the might and wealth of Caris were at their peak, and the land seemed a strength unassailable. It was then the menace of the ice first began to make itself felt among the Svarhoth lands, and the remotest northerners had to flee southwards, even into the Vale. Then, a generation later, a serious conflict of kinship and succession broke out for the first time among the Ysmerian. The sundering of the peoples. The details are simple enough. A king, Gerenin, died, leaving a son and a daughter by different wives. The laws of succession were strict. Daughters could inherit at need, but the son, Barak, was the elder, and there was never any doubt that he would be the rightful successor. But he died within days of his father, and though he was of mature years, and his wife had recently borne him a son, there was grave doubts as to whether the child, though named for him, was in fact his, and what followed fed that doubt. His widow, Amur, immediately instilled as regent Not Beric's younger sister, Althae, as was customary, but their cousin, Dormaid, one of the most able and powerful southern lords. By a coincidence of ancestry, he was a pure-blooded Ysmerian, a well-made man of great charm and vigor, and he was also a former suitor of Amur. The resultant furor threatened to split the country, for if the child was not Berek's, then Althae was the rightful heir, and after her, her son Karen. But Dormaid enjoyed great support among powerful men of both Penruthia and Svarhoth, and of both ancestral factions. Fewer supported Althea, young widow of a Ysmerian landholder and of no great distinction, but she showed great firmness in claiming the throne on behalf of her son. For many years the whole land simmered, without ever quite bursting into the flame of civil war. Even the ancestral factions were split down the middle, although the older aristocracy tended to support Althae and the newer Dormade. Dormade was the effective ruler, but his power was never absolute enough to put down his enemies, and to do him justice, he had no particular wish to, restraining the most hot-headed of his followers. It was charged he had murdered Barek, but his later behavior made this less likely. Althae was less restrained, but could never whip up enough sure support. However, her supporters' minor insurrections seriously disrupted the trade of the land and deepened divisions. When the garrison of the High Gate declared for her, she occupied it and set up her own court there, and over a period of years intrigue to little effect against Dormade. Meanwhile, the two children were growing up. The younger Berek as a powerless shadow under Dormade's overwhelming personality, and Karen as an independent and intelligent young prince. As he grew up, it became obvious that he was the most attractive character in the whole tangle. When he reached his first manhood, in his 16th year as the custom then was, his mother was persuaded to hand over her claim to him, and swiftly he gained greater support than she ever had. Dormade himself, eager to end the disruption, offered him joint succession with Berek. But Berek, for the first time in his life, objected violently. He threatened Karen's life, and swore bloody retribution against the least man who supported him. Civil war now began to seem inevitable when Dormade died, if not sooner, and men on either side began to arm and prepare, and break off what slight contact they had kept with their opponents. Towns on one side or the other hounded out minorities lest they launch a surprise attack, and murders and brawls began to multiply. This prospect, on top of the years of squabbling he had known, saddened and disgusted Karen, and the news of the advancing ice brought by the northern refugees, remote as it seemed to most, filled this far-sighted prince with alarm for the future. He was in the mood to find some new alternative when one presented itself. Mariners had long suspected the existence of another land across the oceans. Wide-ranging fishermen claimed to have fished off its shores, though none had dared to land. Now, some bold Svarhoth shipowners, desperate for new profits after some 14 years of decaying trade, set out to find it in earnest. One part succeeded, after great privations, and returned to tell of a vast new land of forests and high mountains, wild and uninhabited as far as they could tell, but fertile and full of promise. Most significantly of all, it was relatively untroubled by the ice. For Karen, that was enough, and he resolved to seek out a new home in this land. To Dormade and Berek, he sent a defiant challenge saying that though he asserted his birthright still, he preferred to extend his realm rather than lay it waste with war. And since the folk must be divided, let those who favored his cause come with him to settle this new land. Dormade would not hinder any who wished to go, but would assist them with ships and resources. Then, rightfully or not, he might rule those who remained. Dormade accepted this with relief, for he too hated the prospect of war. He ignored the wrath of Berek, who foresaw, rightfully, that many would desert the land rather than face his rule, shrinking his inheritance and injuring his pride. In fact, many even among his own supporters were piqued by the idea and the taste of adventure, and the number who responded surprised even Karen. Men and women of every quality, of every allegiance and faction joined with him, until the size of the expedition began to alarm Dormade. But by then, events had gathered momentum, and there was little he could do. Berek's attempts to deter recruits by threatening the kin they were leaving behind simply swelled their numbers further, as he might have expected, and led to open conflict between Dormade and himself. In the end, some 5 years later, it is said that more than a fifth of the entire Penruthia population of Karis chose to follow Karen, and close to half the Svarhoth. And the majority of these were able-bodied folk in their prime years, so that the loss of the land was far greater. Many more would have come, if they could have hoped to survive the voyage. More ships were needed than the land could possibly dispose of, and it may well be that the great clearing of forests began at this time, and that the timber taken was never fully replanted. There is no reason to doubt the chronicle's picture of the fleet at last assembled on the shores below the gate, darkening the ocean and stilling its waves by the very number of its hulls. The number of people who sailed in them is harder to be sure of, but since at that time Karis was mightier and better peopled than when Elof and Rock came there, it is possible that 100,000 at least set sail with Karen that day, and like him, looked their last upon the beacon of the gate until even its last wisp of smoke had vanished utterly beneath the remorseless horizon. It was a blow from which, perhaps, Karis never quite recovered. Soon after the sailing, Berek, supported by many who were suffering its consequences, raised a rebellion against Dormade and toppled him. He became king, and his heirs after him, and save for one act of cruelty, he was not as bad a ruler as his beginning had promised. His worst fault was a certain weakness and indecision, which had perhaps been seen in Dormade also, and inability to restrain the warring factions. Yet it is not unlikely that he did indeed represent some altered strain in the Ysmerian, for though after him, as before, there were kings strong and weak, good and less good, that indecisive nature appeared more and more often, till in the end the kings were reduced to puppets of their powerful warlords and marshals, and were at the last overthrown by one such of the Lonian line, who took their place, and his great-grandson was Nethade. That act of cruelty was significant. It is said that Berek took Dormade to the shore and mockingly sent the defeated regent and a few close companions to sea in an ill-equipped hulk, bidding them also seek new kingdoms to conquer. Cruel as this was to a man very likely his own father, it is possible to understand the grievance he bore. The land was cruelly impoverished by losing so many, and the nature of its people changed. The Svarhoth, in particular, dwindled from that time, becoming a far smaller adjunct to the Penruthia than they were anywhere in the new land save only Kerbrahane, and without them, as Elof suspected, Karis began to follow the same downward slope. Together, both strains added up to a great people, but with their mutual influence removed, each followed their own particular downward paths, into harsh and demoralized decadence, or sullen rusticity, respectively. Clearly, some more radically blending was needed in them both, and it may be that it was this, harsh as it seemed, that the downfall of all their lands and the ending of the long winter provided. Of the fortunes of the folk of Caris in its immediate aftermath, a little is known, for one or two fortunate ships still managed to escape across the oceans to Morvenhall in the years that followed. Relatively few lives were lost. From the wake of that unnatural winter, a sudden and balmy summer followed, and a sudden explosion of growth. The wild lands, to which most in the north had escaped, took flower and fruited, and rough patches could be cleared and sown here and there, and shelters built against the coming winter. In the south, the jungle also provided some food, so few, if any, starved, but the life they clung to was hard, with hardly a trace of its former luxury, or even of civilization. The Duergar might have helped, fallen as they too were, but the gulf between them and men was grown too wide. Objects of fear they were and remained to the sundered folk. Of the north, the last that was heard, a generation later, spoke of a reversion to the levels of the Stone Age, and of the south, nothing. In so short a time was the glory of that land brought at last to the dust. Yet against the span of time, even all the millennia of its rise and fall seem little longer, and are swallowed up in that great river so thoroughly that they might as well never have been. Languages. The tongues of Caris were, like its peoples, very close to those of their kin in Bracehall, and more has been said of these in earlier appendices. However, they were less close than they would appear from the texts of the chronicles suggest, and it is likely that Rock and Elof had a great deal more trouble making themselves understood than the accounts suggest. The grammar of both versions of Penruthia appears to have remained substantially intact over the long period of their separation, but such matters as word termination had altered drastically, and even the meanings of many common words. The accents also had changed. Rock had the advantage here, for Elof's clear northern accents sounded alien to the Penruthia, though not unpleasant, and startlingly august to northerners such as Treichgar. It was as if an Englishman of today were addressed by a fine speaker of Shakespeare's English. The northern tongue had changed less, for its speakers had become an extreme minority, and as minorities do, they guarded their tongue jealously, hugging it close to them and teaching and using it with meticulous care. Arcane beliefs and arts. Of these also much else has been said earlier, but some points arise only in the Book of the Armring. In Caris, for example, the probable origin of the river as a concept of time and the cycles of the world, and as a border and barrier to the land of the dead, are best seen, for to the first men who looked upon it, that awesome flow must have seemed like the bounds of the world indeed. At some later date, though, the Milky Way seems to have become identified with the metaphysical river, and been given the same name. But by Kermorven's day it was no longer seriously thought of in that sense, save by the least educated of folk, and the river had become a wholly philosophical concept. Yet nevertheless, that misty streak across the night skies persisted as a symbol of potent meaning, at least as significant as the ice glow which seemed to be forever and futilely seeking to blot it out. By the time the rather vague concept of reincarnation the peoples of Caris favored had coalesced, and for that also the river became a symbol, as something set afloat upon the Yeskiennis' waters would eventually find shore elsewhere, so might the returning spirit, unless it were weighted or dragged down. It is interesting that Elof is not made by the chroniclers to endorse that, as one might expect, but to declare his ignorance of it. Evidently, they wish to stress that within this world, even the powers have bounds, for better or for worse. Smithcraft. In the chronicles, the nature of Elof's smithcraft is discussed and debated at every turn, as to whether it was an attribute of a human or a power. But these present accounts could hardly reflect, without revealing more than Elof himself knew at the time. The conclusion come to is the one that Elof suggests in passing, that all smithcraft in humanity was a gift of the powers, a counterbalance to what they knew its foes would one day hurl against it. Whether or not the gift was reclaimed or exhausted, or simply lies dormant for want of knowledge to awaken it, cannot be said. But Elof's case is clear. Those who came before him had been more than human, and that was their glory, and all too often their downfall. So Elof had, by the very nature of his mission, to be no more than human if he was to succeed. So though the power he had was great, it must have been no more than the most a human might have had, albeit an exceptional one, or, more probably, it was as great as any human might have found within himself, had he only the will to awaken it. It was a great endowment, yet without the dedication to learn its uses, and the skills to exploit them, it would have been meaningless. It was in these that Elof's true achievement lay, and in these that his mastery truly surpassed any other of that time. Certainly the materials and processes he used, though mysterious, are not wholly beyond our own comprehension. The mirror shields seem to have been no more than some light and hard alloy, perhaps upon a bracing frame of wood or metal tube. Their chiefest subtlety lay in their shape, which caught and concentrated the sun so well, and in the truly mysterious influence that held them in such unison both as shield wall and as solar mirror. Such tight coordination and focusing is a problem which bedevils modern solar furnaces. They are capable of astonishing temperatures, such as the power the sun sheds upon us, but are very clumsy at concentrating it. Nevertheless, there is evidence that some part of this problem was solved in ancient times. The Greek philosopher Archimedes, among the defenses he created for his home city of Syracuse, is said to have fired enemy ships by just such a burning glass, a feat historians have long sneered at because of the problems such mirrors involve. But recently a more practical archaeologist realized that he might have used the long Greek shields, highly polished, and tried an experiment with some 20 modern replicas of these, representing quite a good-sized area of reflector. Under the noon sun, their combined beams were well able to set afire the timbers of a boat moored in the harbor. Elof's shields represented a surface thousands of times greater, and much more carefully and uniformly shaped. In such greater numbers and more skillfully shaped, and with their beams concentrated by the master shields into near perfect intensity, they might have achieved astonishing temperatures. It is ironic that the ice's ultimate plan was to raise the world's albedo and so reflect away the life-giving solar energy, for Elof simply reflected it back at them. That fine fiber of which both Gorthar and his wings were shaped is rather more mysterious to our eyes. Yet, essentially, it was almost certainly more refinement of carbon, or graphite fibers, many varieties of which we can produce under a very great and sustained heat. And of such a heat in his day, some kinds of lava flow would have been an adequate source. Such fibers depend for their remarkable properties upon their crystalline structure, and the ability the Duergar taught him to study this under heat must have given him wide control over them. This, incidentally, the chronicles speak of as if it was a natural ability, but more probably he made use of some device, and his own subtlety lay in the true interpreting of it. For in this, as in all else, he was as he wished his friends to think him, a man only. Such signposts as he left himself, all those generations past, would have been meaningless as his power without the will and daring to exploit them, and the sheer disregard of himself. Had he not shed his old life willingly, it is likely his labors, and most of all those in the furnace, would have curtailed it, or at any rate brought on him a miserable and suffering old age. But the greater flame that burned within him spared him that. The Duergar. In the Book of the Sword, some brief glimpses remain of the Duergar people at what, in these latter years, was very probably their peak. In the Book of the Helm, their decline and disappearance is hinted at, and in the Book of the Armring, its progress is seen. They were undoubtedly a very ancient folk, and equally a very strange one by the standards of ordinary men. To grasp something of how alien they were, one needed only consider a race who were aware of many of the possibilities of science and technology, up to and including some grasp of the structure of matter and the potential energies it could unleash, yet who chose not to pursue or exploit that knowledge. Neither their dwelling underground, nor their characteristic physical shape can set them further apart from men than that, for they were enough like us to interbreed, and they had not always dwelt beneath the earth. Some of them could understand men, and even become friends with them, and more, as has been seen. In the end, as the world changed about them, many united with men, and brought with them their many virtues. But these were always a small minority. Ildrian, as he is shown to us, is much more characteristic of the majority of Duergar, a cold and remote personality, with his concept of ethics governed by payment and return, even in a forced bargain. Elof's assessment of him shows how well he understood these people, for reasons that he could not have realized at that time. It is ironic that, when he first sought their help, he was himself, without knowing it, demanding a quid pro quo, for it was to the power he had once been that the whole race owed its very survival. The beginnings of the Duergar. Some words of Ilse's, which are not included in the tale, throw a grim light upon this. They were spoken in royal council to support Kermorvan's plan to aid Karis, and promised the Duergar's aid. "We should act, and act in time, for once before we have stood here and failed to, and it was almost the end of us. Not for nothing do you call us the elder folk, for all that you are, we once were, all and more. Once we too had spread out across the world, had explored the secrets of nature to their depths, only to find what gulfs lay beyond them. We too dreamed ourselves rulers of the world, not brief tenants of another's halls. Then the ice came. Then that earlier long winter rolled over us, and scoured away all that we had built. Had Ilmarinen not helped us, shaped us our refuges beneath the the hollow hills and taught us new ways to live and to survive. Then we should have been altogether destroyed. We were neither as numerous nor as aggressive as you humans. We were not so ready to rip the whole wide world apart and tack it back together again to suit us. We might have been driven back to savagery, and if both your race and mine do not act for themselves now, we may yet be. One alone came to help us when it seemed that all other doors were shut, and many hope he will again. But I fear even his face is turned from us now. This was not so, for Elof himself sat by her as she spoke those words, as she afterwards recalled. But she was right, in that he had no intention of maintaining the Duergar in the state he had left them, even had he the power to do so. As he himself had suggested in his plea to the old King Andvar, Ilmarinen had saved them for a purpose, that the riches of their culture might not wholly vanish from the world, that they might serve as a bridge and an inspiration to struggling future generations, just as he promised Kermorven he should. To that end, he had sought almost to store them underground, in an environment and a way of life that was relatively fixed, hoping that when the winter was spent and the ice withdrew, they would emerge and join the new men coming into their lands and teach them their ancient wisdom. To some extent, his plan worked. As Il suggested, many of the greatest works of the men of the elder days were created with advice, at least, from the Duergar. The High Gate, for example, would not have been possible without their skill with stone. Even in less happy days, men might, from time to time, awake their interest or their compassion, which was greater than might have been expected, and learn from them again. So it was with the Mastersmith, and so also Elof himself, though it may have counted for much with the more obdurate of them that he had saved many of their people's lives, and had only his own and one other in return, for on such petty balances their ethics might rest. They could be generous with their gifts, if they took to a human, and undoubtedly he learned much from them, even more than smithcraft, either directly or from what the Mastersmith had gleaned. His skill in navigation came from them, and more arcane knowledge, often of a quite startling extent. The account of the reasoning by which he grasped Lohi's intention to use the volcanoes of Karis, and perhaps of the wetlands before that, is notable because it suggests that he had some knowledge of the existence of continental platforms, the so-called plates. But equally, he seemed not to have understood anything of their movement and interaction, or any of the processes with which modern plate tectonics is concerned. Most probably, therefore, his knowledge was second-hand, and not a result of his own deductions. There is nowhere else he could have come by it save from the Duergar, and it is more likely his fault than theirs that he did not grasp the full concept. And indeed, such drift would be a hard thing to grasp in a world half shelled in ice, but the Duergar remembered it differently. But a certain amount of teaching and advice was as much as the Duergar would ever give in the years before his coming, and these were exceptions. Even in their best relations with men, they would rarely do more than dwell among them for a brief while, then return with relief to their own. Ultimately, Ilmarnen's plan proved a failure because, no doubt, much as he loved the race had made the Duergar, he understood them little better than their human cousins. The elder folk, buffeted by climate and destiny, had come to despise the outside world and grown contemplative and inward looking, suspicious even of their own kin from elsewhere. They forgot their purpose, or scorned it, and for the most part an enmity grew up between them and the men that they made little effort to avoid. Instead, they fled, shunning the animals as they deemed them, and joined their kin in scattered halls elsewhere. In the end, as Andvar told, they fled halfway round the world to escape mankind, but they could not flee forever. Man was their destiny, and with him they were doomed to mingle, or perish in their own isolation. Yet that bleak end was what many at last preferred, and it is doubtful whether any of that race yet walk the world. Yet some did join with men, and their influence was a good one, for it is known that members of that race, which was born of their mingling, sank to the simplest savagery ere they rose again. But what little we have of them speaks well. Even their crude stone tools were fairly made, and they buried their dead with care, and filled the graves with flowers. The Duergar languages. In earlier books of the Chronicles, mention is made of the sound of the Duergar tongue, or tongues, for there were several, but few attempts were made to reproduce any of them. The Book of the Armoring has more than the others that concern Eloth, and that only a few scattered words and phrases, clumsily translated. Even these survive from a single text, probably the oldest surviving. In later copies, they were omitted altogether. This probably indicates the reason. The tongues in which the chronicles were written were preserved long after they fell from use. First as a classical tongue of refined expression, and later as a mystery language, guarding secrets only for the initiate. But the Duergar languages no man of later ages knew. Even those Duergar who, in the general changing of the world, chose to throw in their lot with men, never taught them any Duergar tongue, lest it compromise the safety of their kin who remained apart. For this reason, little can be made of what is left. The original author had no alternative but to transcribe it phonetically, using whatever ideographic characters sounded approximately right. And it must be remembered that each character in itself also stood for a word. The effect of this may be gauged by comparing the pseudonym a Japanese writer borrowed from his favorite Western author, Edogawa Rampo, to the original. He was referring to Edgar Allan Poe. What an immense span of time could do to this, in which characters and sound forms changed and mistakes and improvements were introduced into the copying, is best left to the imagination. So to the later copyists, whatever Duergar words were included must have seemed like meaningless gibberish. Sooner or later, they were bound to be edited out. From what little remains, as has been said before, some deductions have been made. One or two words suggest some ancestral affinity with the rather unusual Finno-Ugric family of languages, but this cannot be proven. It seems to have sounded much more like a Slavic tongue, however, and for that reason it has been rendered into a Slavic form. Attempts have been made to make the meaning of what is spoken clear from the accompanying dialogue, though it should be noted that Ildrian's final comment appears to be moderately obscene. The Duergar were never known for primness, and there are signs that some of Ilza's more pungent comments have been censored by later generations. If so, most unfairly, as she was renowned even among her own folk for the imaginative nature of her insults. In most cases where a human being was present, of course, Duergar would speak the northern tongue. This was partly for reasons of secrecy, but also because they found it a very convenient lingua franca between themselves. Which of their languages took precedence could often have some social or political significance, and was hard to settle. The human tongue, which they found easy to master, avoided the question neatly. Why it was Svarhoth they spoke is uncertain. Ills, who spoke both Svarhoth and Penruthia, claimed it was because the furry northern speech sat more easily in their mouths than the southern, which she thought sounded slimy. This may well have been so, but it may have been adopted simply because Duergar tended to prefer the same slightly cooler climates of the Svarhoth, and so come into contact with them more often. By Elof's time, almost all Duergar spoke some Svarhoth, even their names, though they originated in their own tongues, they habitually rendered into northern form, and only in that form are they preserved. The Eqwesh peoples. The various books of the Winter Chronicles contain much incidental lore concerning these savage folk, but the Book of the Armring most of all, probably because it tells of the first encounter with the ravens. For that reason, it is best gathered here. As with the Duergar, examples of their speech are preserved in the oldest texts only, and no doubt for the same reasons. The Eqwesh tongues. It is known that there were many of these, 3 at least, that were naturally closely related, but not always mutually understandable because they had so many dialects. The majority tongue, like Mandarin Chinese, became almost universally spoken, but jealousies between tribes and clans ensured that it did not oust their own tongues. It became almost a point of honor to speak it, or any foreign speech, as badly and curtly as possible. The result was that most Eqwesh sounded crude and monosyllabic to outsiders. The Ravens, however, spoke the majority tongue as their own, in a particularly old-fashioned form, much like the one Elof had learned a little of from the Mastersmith. It may have flattered the Raven chieftain to hear him speak it. None, however, had any written form. A few Eqwesh could read and write the Carisborn languages, but this was not an achievement highly regarded, even when it proved useful. It was, after all, something regarded, even when it proved useful. It was, after all, something thralls could do. Even the shamans and chieftains preserved their lore orally, reinforced only by a mnemonic system, patterns of odd characters that operated as a more sophisticated equivalent of the Inca Quipu, or medievally tally sticks. Totally unintelligible when its sphere of reference was unknown. It is thought that this was forced upon them by the ice, to keep them dependent on it for dribs and drabs of knowledge, which could be handed out over and over again as some new gift, and also, very probably, to prevent any true culture from developing. For this reason, even in the oldest texts of the Chronicles, only a few words of Eqwesh are preserved, spelt much as they sounded to Svarhoth or Penruthia speakers. And since we cannot tell from an ideographic system exactly how those tongues sounded, the Eqwesh speech is well and truly lost. It appears to have been an agglutinative type, highly expressive but cumbersome and fiendishly complicated to those who had not grown up with it. The whole phrase, vault out of a boat, became a single verb, out of a boat with one hand to leap, as it might in many primitive languages today, for example certain Inuit and Northwest Coast languages. Such words as can be salvaged have been included in the text, but they amount at best to an informed guess. The Equesh realm and its origins. Much information about the land and history of the Equesh peoples is put by the chroniclers into the mouth of their chieftain, speaking with Elof. More certainly than he would ever have told a prisoner, even one he had come to respect. But this is a common enough device in such histories, and it was undoubtedly from the ravens that most such lore came. Of their homeland, in particular, no outsider left any account. It is not hard to guess why. It is known to have lain in the lands far east of Caris, separated from it by a land so trackless and wild that the ice actually became the safest means for the Equesh to cross, and to have reached the furthest shores of the oceans that lapped upon the westlands of Brihane, where Elof and Kermorven grew up. Its exact extent is unknown, but undoubtedly it covered more actual land than any other realm among men at that time, perhaps more than all the rest put together. But so miserable and barren was most of this land, barely able to sustain life, that population densities were very low. The Equesh people arose as hardy hunter-gatherers with only the simplest of cultures, living a nomadic, seasonal existence, and making the best of the savage and hostile environment which was all they knew. At this stage, they seem to have lived not unlike the natives of Tierra del Fuego, who astonished European explorers by their ability to live more or less naked, with only crude shelters of branches and grass, within 5 degrees of the southern polar ice pack. The Equesh lands also lay in the proximity of the ice, and it dominated their climate, adding to the long and terrible winters it sent the brief, fierce summer that was natural to the region. Each season brought extremes, from heavy snow to floods to drought to torrential rains and snow again, in a ruthless cycle. So bleak was their land that it was a marvel these ancestors of the Equesh survived. With only a little more effort, the ice might well have exterminated them entirely, as it sought to do to all other races of men. Why, then, did it fail to? There is some suggestion that the Equesh land was a reservation created by the ice, or more properly, an arena. By pushing the lands to the limits of habitability, therefore, they sought to create a breed of men apt to their ways. Whether this is so, or whether some among the powers of the ice simply seized upon what they found, the fact remains they soon began to take an active part in the shaping of the Equesh folk. Formerly, they had relied for warriors upon the lesser powers among their own numbers, forcing them into strange and fearsome forms, and upon lesser creatures they had bred and deformed into monsters, and only secondarily upon men. They had recruited such renegades as can always be found, individuals or tribes, but these proved rare and highly undependable, and often at a crucial moment chose the kinship of their true kind. For even in the worst among men, some small spark may not be wholly extinguished. So after a series of formidable defeats, not least those inflicted by Caris in the days of its first grandeur, they seem to have concluded that only men could defeat men, and sought to reshape these troublesome creatures to their own ideas, and perhaps their own preconceptions. The Cult of the Ice. Undoubtedly, these rebel powers saw men as substantially base, brutish, and vicious, and this judgment may have been reinforced by the urges which came to bedevil them whenever they assumed human form, and which they had never learned to control. So they began to force these strong but unformed folk, whose society already had all the savagery and ruthlessness necessary to hunters who must kill to live, into a society that, so they thought, would best express this human baseness and channel it in ways useful to them. In subtle ways, they began to take hold of the ancestors of the Ekwesh and to lead them along the paths they chose. These were often very dark, for it was among the depths of the human mind that the ice sought its hold, and among the blacker desires and pleasures of men. Perhaps it amused those cold minds to dominate those they despised by what harmed them most, by unleashing their own worst urges, by cruelty and torture and the bonds that bind those who have done a thing unthinkable to others. The Ekwesh, under the tutelage of the ice, became a folk bloody and fell, to whom the causing of pain and the shedding of blood were not an evil, not even a means to an end, but an end in themselves. A propitiation to be offered and a pleasure to be shared. From Elof's intimacy with the master smith, we know that it enforced austerities upon its highest initiates, no doubt, as the chronicler suggests, to direct their energy and avoid distractions, and fearsome journeys into the heart of the ice to commune there with its rulers, which must have involved the initiate forcing himself to survive in an environment that made little or no concession to the human body. The lives of the hidden clan lost in its march eastward over the ice to Morvanik were simply what it expected of dedicated men. From Brihon's revelations, we know that self-torment or even mutilation was demanded of them, and from accounts of Ekwesh captives and grisly discoveries aboard their ships and in their camps, we know that it demanded human torture and sacrifice from its followers. But of the actual rites of its worship, we know only the most general details, mostly from thralls who were fortunate enough to see them and survive to be freed. As was mentioned in earlier appendices, the shamans relied on ecstatic and visionary rites, dancing themselves into a frenzy to drumbeats to release their inner powers. This appears to have been a cruder analog to the concentration and labor of smithcraft, and its effects, naturally, were more transient. This their followers appeared to have imitated, but to what end, and in what ways, is unknown. Unless, perhaps, we may see some distant reflection of them in the many strange rites of veneration and fear still associated with glaciers, such as those practiced in a thinly Christian guise by native South Americans across a wide range of the Andes in the Choloridi festival. In this, the participants, the so-called ukuku dancers, wear bear masks, carrying a great cross. They climb up to the glaciers that loom over their mountain homes, and there spend a night above the snowline in a vigil initiated by a symbolic whipping. This is intended to propitiate the condenados, ghoul spirits, now said to be those of the damned, who are supposed to inhabit the glacier and protect the festival pilgrims from them. In the morning, they use their whips as saws to cut out huge lumps of the glacier, and these they carry as a penance down to the festival sanctuary, in a procession accompanied by the pilgrims with wild hooting cries. This ritual destruction of the glacier is thought to enact the penance of the condenados and release both them and their intended victims. In this, and many other examples, some relic of the dominion and terror of the ice may yet remain. The Eqesh Empire. In fact, of course, human beings are neither so simple nor so easily coerced, whatever the ice may have believed. Even under that yoke, at its worst, the Eqesh kept many natural human virtues the ice could not suppress. These it had to contain by channeling them inwards. Love was limited to the closest of kindred only, and became a fierce and jealous thing. That many times led to a slaying when it was in any way balked or betrayed. Man and wife, father and children, were linked by a bond whose very strength and rigidity made it perilous. Loyalty and respect extended only to the tribe, and no further. Intermarriage was possible, but the wife was seldom well regarded, nor, sometimes, children. Those outside the family could command no affection. Those outside the tribe might be foes or allies, but never friends. Those who were not Eqesh were only potential victims or thralls, and thralls were scarcely human. An Eqesh might father children upon a thrall woman, but those children would be marked thralls, and so also their children's children, to the end of their line, even if all the fathers were Eqesh, and the blood be almost pure. An Eqesh woman conceived by a thrall, if something so unthinkable were to happen, would be slaughtered out of hand, and her child with her, by her closest kin, as being unfit even for sacrifice. Yet even in this harsh society, individual Eqesh still retained surprising depths. Some families, especially among the Ravens, had a tradition of treating their thralls humanely, and though this earned them the contempt of others, it often gained them greater labor, and so greater riches. For slaves have little to gain by working harder, but these wished their master to prosper, if only for their own protection. So such masters often became rich and powerful, and some slight force for better ways. However, there were stronger voices set against them, for the ice had chosen its chief spokesman with cunning. These were the shamans, the wise men of the tribes. From the earliest days it had recruited them and trained them in its cult, arming them with arcane knowledge and teaching them to enhance and develop the innate power that men of Karis called smithcraft, but which the ice claimed was its gift. From their association with the ice, they derived great prestige and authority, and from presiding over the atrocious rites it prescribed. Often, they became the true rulers behind the tribal chiefs, who became merely war leaders. But sometimes they became chieftains themselves. The one whom Elof first encountered in Asenby seems to have been of this breed, as also their younger captor in Morvanik. It was under the influence of the earliest and most charismatic of these leaders, men trained by the ice powers, or even the powers themselves in human form, that the most savage tribes in the north of the land first began to link up, sometimes by alliance, most often by conquest. They gathered into a few very large tribes under the name totem of whichever group had made itself dominant. The strength of unity gave them greater mastery over their land, and their numbers began to increase rapidly. Soon they were outstripping the land's ability to support them, and under the pressure of the ice and the goading of necessity, they began to raid their most southerly neighbors to live, and at last press down into their land. So the pattern of the Eqesh expansion, grow, raid, and then settle to grow again, was set in motion, and for 1,000 years it did not change. The same process drove them over the seas to the Westlands, and overland to Caris. Some of these southern tribes had abandoned a nomadic existence and developed the beginnings of agriculture, and the Ekwesh were not slow to see that this was a surer way of gaining food, but it posed a problem. To them, hunting and warfare were proper occupations for men, and the practice of crafts. Gathering was women's work, at best, and the drudgery of cultivation inconceivably demeaning, not to say impossible for a nomad. So perhaps, with guidance from the ice, their attitude began to change. Instead of butchering their adversaries outright, they made thralls of them and set them to produce food. They themselves remained semi-nomadic and developed that mode of life to great heights. They moved as overlords between these communities of thralls, sessers, still nomadic and free. They would oversee planting and return to oversee the harvest, leaving the thralls to cultivate the land meanwhile, knowing that if they slacked or failed, their masters would consume their own food, and perhaps them also. Though unusual, this society was recognizable, if more extreme version of the periodic taxing rounds levied by the Rus of Kiev, or the Norwegian Vikings upon the Slav towns of the interior, as described by the warrior Otter, who visited the court of Alfred the Great. The Ekwesh, however, carried it further, extending the same principle to mines and shipyards, and even small manufactories and market towns. The thralls became less a mercantile subclass, but always at the mercenary of their fundamentally less civilized overlords. Any development more advanced, however, was always held back by the Ekwesh's understandable fear of giving thralls too much power, as the Spartans feared the Helots, and this goes some ways as Caris or Morvennic, or even rural Norderney. To them they represented what might happen when thralls got out of hand, and were to be subjugated as soon as possible lest they set their own thralls a bad example. Any awe or impression civilization might have made upon them, that fear, encouraged no doubt by the ice, swallowed up. Up to that point, however, the Ekwesh prospered. The surpluses created increased their populations still further, and redoubled their need to expand. By now, many of their remaining neighbors, who were mostly along the eastern seaboard, saw what was coming and fled overseas, or even, in desperation, over the ice. These were the hapless fugitives who poured into Norderney only a brief time after the Svarhoth fugitives from Morven, and made common cause with them. Those who did not flee were swiftly overwhelmed. But as the Ekwesh ran out of land and neighbors to conquer, they ran into their first serious check, and it was one of the ice's own making. It had bred to Ekwesh to be its conquerors, spreading savagery over the other realms of men. But for them to expand into those realms, they had to achieve some degree of unity, some semblance of empire, or organize their armies. And it was precisely those aspects of human nature which made unity possible that the ice had suppressed. The tribes had always fought one another, making and breaking alliances as the moment's advantage dictated. But for centuries it had been chiefly their thralls who had suffered, and that too drove the Ekwesh outwards. A defeated tribe would lose some possessions, then seek to conquer some more. But now, with none left to conquer, save far off over unknown lands and seas, they were beginning to turn on each other in savage earnest. The ties of common kinship had been made too slack to restrain them. The ice had to tighten its grip somehow and force unity upon them, and to do so, it sought to rely upon the influence it had long wielded over men, the sheer superstitious awe it could evoke. The Hidden Clan. The Hidden Clan, therefore, which came into being around this time, seems to have been wholly a development of the ice. A secret blood brotherhood of chosen shamans and shaman chieftains from all the tribes, in which the bonds established through elaborate ordeal and ceremonial, and reinforced by shared purpose, overrode the limited interests of individual tribes. In this, it somewhat resembled the intertribal Freemasonry practiced among the Australian Aborigines, being signified by elaborate patterns of cicatrices scars, but in a much more organized form, and wholly sinister in its practices and aspirations. At first, as its name suggests, it had to remain secret, so strong was the intertribal distrust. Many members were lynched outright by their own followers. But as time passed and the benefits of some degree, at least, of coordination between tribes became clearer to the ordinary clansman, membership commanded first tolerance and then respect and fear. Many initiates came to display or even to vaunt their status as a point of pride, by negative means such as bearing an abstract pattern, perhaps with an arcane meaning, instead of their totem. Lesser men began to copy them, and such secret societies grew up at a lower level between the tribes, but without seriously affecting the barriers between them. When there was conflict, tribes still told over society almost every time. It was the Hidden Clan that organized the armies that crossed the ice to begin the centuries of campaign against Karis, and a century or two later developed the arts of shipbuilding and sailing that sent the black ships raiding oversea on the trail blazed by the fugitives, to assail the westlands of Kerbrahane and Norderney. These were achievements, but they were slow in coming, many times hindered by intertribal jealousy and strife, even within the clan itself. Some lesser clans, of which the Ravens were the most significant, distrusted its domination by the larger tribes and held aloof. The Hidden Clan and its imitators were an imperfect means to an end, and the ice was forever in search of something better. But none came until the Mastersmith Mylio appeared on the scene. The Mastersmith's design. Over the centuries, the ice had seduced a number of men to its side, including smiths of greater power than he, but never before such a scholar. His fanatical energy drove him to acquire the greatest library of any man living at his time, to seek ancient knowledge among the Duergar, and among the Equesh themselves, at his continual peril. This he found, as the Book of the Sword recounts, chiefly from observation and study of the subtle ways in which the shamans had refined the magecraft taught them by the ice to help them control their folk. He synthesized this knowledge with others, as the shamans could not do, and he applied it to the human minds with a finesse the ice could never match. So he conceived the Mind Sword, and so, equally, his inability to forge such a thing. He sought one who could do the work for him, leaving only the last and simplest for him to complete. But when he tricked Elof into doing so, he was startled by the boy's ability to complete it, and even more so by the power of the result. With such a force in his hands, he set out to second-guess his masters, and rather than turning the sword over to Louhi, leaving him no more than a useful appendage, to unite the Ekwesh under his own leadership, making him indispensable. Almost certainly he hoped to gain status among the powers, even to be made one of them, for such promises they often made to their useful dopes, producing images of the dead as proof. If so, it was a deluding hope, for they were only the mindless shades of Tawun, constructs of memories with no controlling intelligence at their heart save the rebel powers. But those who wished to believe were easy to delude, and the Mastersmith undoubtedly won great status by uniting the Ekwesh. Louhi may have meant to keep him alive, at least, or to bring him more securely under her domination. The changes in him, that eerie bleaching, may have been caused by some spiritual exhaustion of his powers in Louhi's service, but equally they may have been intended to change his body, to fit him for life in a cold environment as Tapaiao altered man for the forests. For there are living things even today that may survive in such conditions. Ice fish, for example, that live in freezing water, by having no hemoglobin in their blood, and they have just that white and pallid look. He had undoubtedly earned some reward, if reward this was, for it was he who, the old chieftain told Elof and Kermorven, first united the tribes into a single, solid fighting force. And, ironically, it was an achievement that his death only reinforced. When Elof destroyed him and the Mind Sword together, the sudden slackening of the sword's hold on their minds, added to the sheer shock of seeing one they had thought a demigod slain and cast down, caused the Ekwesh to flee in panic. But such was the humiliation of this, that for the first time it gave the tribes a common cause strong enough to outweigh their mutual mistrust, the more so as Louhi played upon it. When less than 2 years later the elite troops of the Hidden Clan, to a man chieftains and shamans' sons from many tribes, were wiped out in Morvanik, she had no trouble in bringing them together at last. Even the Ravens, who still scorned the Hidden Clan, and had never shared in the assaults on the Westlands or the madness of the Mind Sword, joined in the oaths to avenge the defeat, and without the witness of Raven himself, even Elof probably could not have swayed them. With Kar to set their hearts ablaze with battle fury, the Ekwesh were in Louhi's grip as much as they had ever been in the Mastersmith's. And when that grip broke, many a mind and heart among them shattered with it, and the old hierarchy of the tribes was broken forever. The Aftermath. In the time that followed, the fate of the Ekwesh became joined once again to that of other men. The Ravens became more humane as the influence of the ice over them dwindled, but they kept much of their stern pride, and gathered the other Ekwesh who joined them under their sway. They posed Kermorven something of a problem in settling them among his own folk, but to him and his line they remained fiercely loyal, and never forgot that allegiance. As the generations passed, they mingled increasingly with their ancient foes, and in particular with the Northerners who resembled them. But their blood was always the hardiest and best suited to life in the increasingly harsh conditions of the declining land. They came to dominate it, until it was in the end wrestled from them, with cruelties as great as any the Ekwesh practiced. But that, alas, is the way of men, in which the ice was not wholly mistaken. In the areas of the land they settled longest, some echoes of that terrible time may still linger, for there it is said of some tribes that they once earned a dark name among their neighbors. Peaceful hunter-gatherers and fishers for the most part, for dark practiced, grim pride, fell magic, the taking of thralls and the eating of man's flesh. Today there is so little evidence of this that it has been disputed, and it may be that such tales are simply an ancestral memory, harking back to times more remote than any can now imagine. In their own homeland, so far as can be told, their empire fragmented and fell apart far more swiftly, for most of those who had held it together perished in the Battle of the Gate, or subsequently. Every major clan was shorn of at least half its leaders, generally the more energetic and fanatical ones, and its most accomplished and dedicated warriors. And from those who remained, the grip of the ice was lifted. At first, perhaps, there was little outward change in their way of life. But as the years passed and new generations arose, and it became clear that the ice was retreating, the old concerns soon lost their force, and the fierce energy waned. The remaining shamans lost much of their power and dominance. Hierarchies of tribe and clan withered, and the barriers between master and thrall softened. Little by little, the realm fragmented as the rising sea swallowed its coasts, and the Eqesh as a people fragmented with it. Many still sailed oversea to Norderney, but as settlers rather than reavers, and it is from them, through the tenuous links to the east, that the last was heard of the once feared Eqesh realm. All else was silence, but those lands have since been the cradle of many a formidable and conquering people, whose names have become as great a byword for savagery in their time as the Eqesh were in theirs. Yet they rarely deserved it quite so thoroughly as did the Eqesh, and it may be that there also some faint memory of their forgotten ancestors has ridden before them like a ghostly banner, which, perhaps, is the memorial they would have wished. But in a better one may remain elsewhere. Those few stragglers who remained in Karis, and were not slaughtered out of hand in the confusion and madness of the early days, also came to mingle with their lighter-skinned neighbors. Unmanned and humbled by what they had experienced, they responded much as the ravens had, and sought new allegiance. There also they won it with their great skill at surviving in the wild, and more swiftly. Mild as was the winter that followed the fall of the gate, many Karis folk would have perished were it not for their aid. One or two became men of great account in the crude tribal life to which the survivors were reduced, but there were never enough of them for their physical type to dominate, as it did in Bracehall, and the race of the Akiyawasha was lost, becoming no more than a name. But when, many thousands of years later, such another tribe of fierce sea rovers arose in those lands, that name was remembered, and either bestowed upon or taken by them in defiant assumption of a heritage. To their earliest enemies, these sea peoples were called Akiyawa or Eqesh, as their hieroglyphics rendered it, and that is the form we have used. But they are better known to us as the Achaeans, the warlike Greeks of Homer. Flora and Fauna. The Book of the Armoring has much to tell of the living things of Karis, for Elof and Rock, having traveled from another continent, often found them very strange. Something is said of the different varieties of tree they saw from the Cog on their long river voyage and elsewhere, but since Elof was forced to remain on the island for so long, animals were mostly mentioned in connection with Rock's travels, which are not germane to the tale. For the most part, it can be said that the animal life is recognizably similar to that in similar latitudes of Elof's own land at this time. Many, however, are made to sound strange, because they are described only in their modern winter coloration. It may well be that they were wearing it all year round, an anomaly that may reflect the worsening state of the climate, and perhaps also the more direct effects of the ice on living things. These were markedly more severe than in Brace Hall, because the mountain ranges were ranged predominantly on north to south axes, and large areas of flat land and forest remained open to migration. In Karis, however, most of the mountains extended from east to west, and as the ice advanced, they left few easy avenues southward. The creation of the secondary ice sheets must have worsened matters even further. Adaptation must have been forced upon animals and plants much more swiftly. Small and domestic animals. Among the commonest small breeds were squirrels, hares, rabbits, lemmings, mustelid predators such as martens and wolverines, and foxes. Hedgehogs and water shrews flourished on the island and were totally new to Elof. Mercifully, it was free of rats and mice, though the city of Karis was not. Dogs and wild kites were the main agents for controlling such vermin. The more efficient cat still rare as a domestic animal outside the houses of wealthy noblemen. These were probably unlike modern cats. From their descriptions, they sound more like domesticated breeds derived from some wilder breeds, such as Felis lunensis, ancestor of Felis silvestris, the modern wildcat. Other domesticated breeds included the huge and temperamental cattle of Karis, the same breed Elof had herded as a child, and some much smaller beast which yielded a woolly fleece, but from its description sounds otherwise more like a goat than a sheep. Certainly no very sharp distinction was then drawn between the two caprine types. It may very well have looked a little like the primitive Soye sheep, lean and long-limbed with substantial horns, but must have been much larger. Less common were domesticated pigs, savage creatures barely distinguishable from the wild hogs they were bred from. These, and their wild cousins, the wild boars, were still common enough to make hunting worthwhile. It was hardly less dangerous than keeping them. Horses were not only ridden, but were the main draft animals of the land. Oxen being stronger, but more dangerous, it seemed strange to Elof that they were none of the hardy little pony-like species native to his own land, with their vestigial extra hooves. Wild animals. Among larger wild animals, the various breeds of mammoth were rare, probably through hunting, but still to be found in the northeastern plains of the wildlands. The same was true of some breeds of woolly rhinoceros. Deer and wisent were still quite common, some breeds of the very great size. One deer Rockshot was larger, he claimed, even than the huge deer of Tapayao's forests, and had a wider spread of antlers. If so, this must almost certainly have been the so-called Irish elk, Megaceros. In the warmer areas, wild cattle of similar enormous bulk still roamed, probably ancestors of the recently extinct aurochs. And there were probably both wild boar and wild hogs in the forests. In the higher areas, chamois were common, and some breed of mountain goats. Large predators seem to have been rare, probably because the land had been so long settled by men. It is known that the early settlers of Karis faced some big cat of appalling size, probably the so-called cave lion, Felis leospelea, a third again as large as modern lions, but this had been quite deliberately hunted down and all but exterminated throughout the land. Some had reappeared in the wildlands, but Elof and Rock ran little risk of encountering them where game was so scarce. Another somewhat smaller cat, probably a descendant of the giant cheetah Acinix pardinensis, was still an occasional threat to livestock in the Southlands. In the northern woodlands, lynxes were still to be found, and on the grasslands a cat of similar size, probably the steppe cat, Felis manuel, wildcats very like today. The bears, as in Elof's land, were very large, but chiefly vegetarian, and rarely aggressive if not provoked. Wolves, once again, were large, but rare, although they had begun to move into the western lands once more as men deserted them, and found fat pickings after the battles that raged there. These creatures are mentioned only incidentally among the many strands of the Chronicles, but one or two creatures feature so predominantly that they deserve some further remarks. Amakak. This astonishing creature, the Sea Devourer, is so unlike any known sea beast, either in living or fossil form, that it might be thought some strange anomalous form natural to a minor power, as were dragons, or yet another of the creation or distortions of the ice. The strong impression of intelligence it left with Elof and Rock is echoed by other surviving witnesses, and suggests this. Yet manifestly the creature was no servant of the ice, for it destroyed its thralls with appalling ferocity and cunning, yet spared their quarry with an almost regal grace. It has been suggested that it might have been a shape assumed by Nyrad, or some other sea-dwelling power, but this is unlikely. There is no record of them ever containing themselves within a single beast, preferring shoals and throngs such as Tapio preferred his trees. What, then, can it have been? It bore the shape of the Plesiosaurus, long-necked prehistoric sea reptiles, but they were long extinct, much smaller, and lived differently. Nor could two such keen observers ever mistake such creatures for any kind of seal or other pinniped. It seems best to accept their identification, therefore, and look for some other evidence. And this exists. In studying the many sightings of the so-called sea serpents around the world, the Dutch scientist Dr. H.C. Oudemans produced a composite picture of a very large marine carnivore resembling a type of seal or otter, but by the same evolutionary convergence that made Ichthyosaurus appear almost identical to dolphins, shaped like a giant plesiosaur. He christened it, somewhat misleadingly, Megophius, or Great Serpent. Though the evidence has been interpreted differently by later researchers, most notably by Dr. Bernard Heuvelmans of Belgium as two distinct species of different size, the distinctive shape and dimensions remain, and they fit the sea devourer all too well. More, it is generally agreed to inhabit colder northern waters, where it was much feared by seamen of previous generations in their small sailing vessels. This might be thought of as a superstition, but in one or two Norwegian fishing museums, giant iron traps can still be found that were set in fjords to ensnare long and questing necks. In a pre-industrial society, the labors of shaping such a trap is not usually devoted to hunting phantoms. It may be worth noting that quite startling intelligence often displayed by sea mammals, not only dolphins and whales, but also seals such as H.G. Hurrell's Atlanta, able to distinguish command words spoken in complex context in a normally toned voice, a feat unusual in any creature. And it is not impossible that with an increased brain size, this might also be enhanced, which is not to say that such intelligence would produce anything like a human mind. What use would a human outlook be in so different a body and lifestyle? But even a very different mind might well be able to share the same repugnance for the common enemy of all things living and recognize a call for help, not least from so powerful a mind as Elof's. Small mammoth. The miniature proboscideans with whom Elof and Rock share Elon Gorenhyans might sound even more problematic than the Sea Devourer, but in fact the existence of such creatures during the long winter is well established. Like similarly dwarfed deer, hippopotami, and ground sloths at various times, they seem to have evolved in island environments where food and living space were limited. Various, very different breeds existed in different parts of the world, but the most likely candidate would be Loxodonta falconeri, or a close relative. This was in fact a true elephant, rather than a mammoth or a mastodon, with long, straight tusks, and it stood no more than 3 feet tall. If it was as curious as its living relatives, it might well have strayed into the smithy in search of food. Swans. The guise of a great black swan, though undoubtedly it reflected something in Kara's nature, may not have been so strange and eerie as it appears. It may have been a shape well adapted to passing unnoticed through the skies of Karis, and perhaps of other lands also. The only living black swan is confined to a small space of the southern hemisphere, is smaller than some northern breeds, and has a slightly comical squeaky cry. But during the long winter, a swan of immense size undoubtedly lived in the Northlands. Fossil evidence suggests that it was among the largest of flying birds, but can tell us no more. Of the hue of its feathers, no trace remains. Trees and plants. The impression gained from Elof's journey and from the map of Karis may be somewhat deceptive. The text of the chronicle tells a truer story. There were still large areas of wooded land in the Vale of Karis, both north and south, but they were sadly reduced from what they had once been, and accounted for a relatively small land area. Much of what remained was merely secondary growth where the old established forests had been cut down, sometimes even a stunted aftergrowth of little use to men and fit only for the smaller beasts. Tapayo's accusation was quite justified. Karis had played the spendthrift with its woodlands, as with every other resource it tapped. This was less true in those that were predominantly Svarhoth, both because they were better foresters and because they had a much smaller population and agriculture. Along the snow line near the gates of the Duergar birch forest still persisted, with dwarf juniper and alpine alders in the barrens, and scrubland of heather and gorse. In the wildlands, species related to all the common evergreen trees of Elof's homeland could be found, save for the redwoods he loved so much. The same was true of deciduous trees, though, as he noticed, they tended to be smaller. Pines, from the descriptions, Scots pines, spruce and firs, beech, and oaks were the commonest trees there, and in the south, sweet chestnut, which was new to him. The Svarhoth had been fond of these, and planted them throughout the forests. Most of these were also found within the warmer climes of the Vale itself, along with less familiar species such as planes, cypresses, cork oaks, tamarisks, and even some fig cactuses and date palms spread from the southern shore, though in the north they were non-fruiting. Beyond Caris itself, in the warmer east, cypress and olive trees were commonest, and along the coasts, maritime and alpo pines. There were some of these on Elon Gorenhayen, among characteristically fragrant scrubland that seems to have been chiefly the evergreen shrub known today as the rock rose, cistus, mingled with broom and gorse, and perhaps also laurel. Ships. Less can be said of the types of ships with which the book deals. The huge ships that Kermorven built with the aid of the Duergar, and the cogs which were the main model in use on the rivers of Caris, than of earlier ones, because no reliable marginalia survive. Evidently, such large ships fell quite swiftly from use as the land declined, and later copyists had never seen them. Their attempts to draw them are fanciful in the extreme. Large warships such as the Prince Corentin seem to have had hulls of a very modern profile, and a system of multiple sails such as the larger rivercraft of the Duergar used. The Dromans have been given that name to distinguish them because they seem to have been simply larger versions of the standard double-ended Kerberheim model, though with a variety of more complex rigs. As the extent to which he kept his smiths and shipwrights busy suggests, Kermorven was constantly experimenting to improve the performance of his ships. What heights he may have eventually reached are suggested by the cutter that bore Rock and Elof across the ocean. If he was able to develop fore and aft rigs sufficiently to apply them to his larger and leaner hulls, he could have achieved craft almost as fast and efficient as the great China clippers. The cog could hardly be more of a contrast. It is given that name because it somewhat resembled the breed of craft that was common on the seas of medieval Europe. A round-bellied ton of a ship, well suited to carrying heavy loads or companies of troops, with equal seaworthiness and ill grace under a simple square sail, with at most a smaller topsail. In versions made or adapted for fighting, as was Treitgar's, towers of planking were added at bow and stern to give archers height to fire down onto an opposing deck. In his boat, and probably in most others of his land, these were kept to a sensible height. But in an earlier breed of arms race, the European types were raised higher and higher, till they often made the ship dangerously unstable, more a threat to its crew than its enemies. And everybody, we have reached the end. Wow, that appendix was really long, huh? Dear God. This guy loves long chapters. I think the appendix was longer than the freaking last chapter of the book. Oh, gotta love it. Well, everyone, we made it to the end of the Hammer of the Sun. I hope you guys enjoyed this trilogy of the Winter of the World. I will, of course, be putting the last chapter, the coda, and the appendix up on my YouTube channel later tonight. I'll get to stop and been drinking periodically throughout. So, stop by the YouTube channel to catch any of the stuff that you missed. Catch the ending, find out what happened, that Elof turned out to be one of the eldest powers who gave up his powers. And, hope you guys enjoyed these as we read through them. I know I sure enjoyed doing it. Starting next week, we will start into a whole brand new series, which should be a ton of fun. Um, I am pretty excited by it, and we'll be good to go from there. Um, Tomorrow, ideally, I should be running my Bloodlords campaign. I am waiting on hearing from one person to make sure that we are actually running the Bloodlords campaign. As long as we are, then we'll be doing that tomorrow. If not, I will figure out something. Because I know I'm already down one person, and if I'm down two, it's too many down to run my campaign. So we'll see how it goes. Um, but I will do something tomorrow night, one way or the other. And then, of course, Thursday will be Stompy Mech Night. Thank you to all of you. The greatest gift that you can give to a streamer is a gift of your time. And I appreciate that you guys have given me the gift of yours, whether it was for 5 minutes or for 3.5 hours. I will see you guys hopefully a little bit later this week. And until then, be good, and I'll see you soon.